Good morning. It looks like everybody has a spot. You guys ready to get started? Maybe. Come on. I'm going to do the teacher thing. You guys ready? Oh, I've always wanted to do that. I'll try it again later in the day. So practice, okay? Good morning, everybody. I'm Elaine Placido, the Executive Director of the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, and I'm so happy to see all of you here today. Many of you I have seen on Zoom calls and Teams meetings over the last several years, and most of you I've never seen the rest of you below here. So what an exciting opportunity to have this topic and to get to see you actually in person. And we have an absolutely beautiful day. Unfortunately, we have the distraction of the window and the view of the beautiful day, but we'll do our best to pay attention. So this is our 14th summit hosted by the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership and the first since 2019. Since 2007, the Science to Policy Summit has brought policymakers, community leaders, and scientists together to share information, ideas, and solutions. Past summits have tackled big topics such as toxic contaminants, climate change, plastic pollution, and marine debris. Needless to say, these problems were all solved by our one-day summit. Thank you, thank you. The power of science to policy is not that it solves problems in a single day. It's that it shines a light on topics that we all care about deeply. It provides a forum for decision makers and scientists to talk to each other, ask questions, understand an issue from a new perspective. It is my hope that with an expanded perspective, we gain the skills to work more effectively to protect and preserve the health of the Lower Columbia River, the people and wildlife who depend on it. Today's science to policy topic, conservation as climate mitigation, using carbon programs to protect and restore ecosystems, was selected from a long list of potential topics. It was one topic that generated the most apprehension. And I took that as a sign that more conversation, not less, was necessary. The buzz around carbon markets is loud, and rather than inserting earplugs, the scientists at the Estuary Partnership leaned in and decided that it was important to bring policymakers, land managers, business leaders, and scientists together to discuss how their work is intertwined and what information they need from each other to navigate this shared landscape. I want to thank my team at the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, particularly our chief scientist, Catherine Corbett, for shepherding the summit along. Aaron Goodell, who is running around back there in the back, Jasmine Zimmerstucky, who sadly could not be here today, and the rest of our amazing team, all of our staff and board who assisted in some way, including our big canoe paddlers, and hopefully many of you got to sign up for that lunchtime treat. And I also want to thank the Honorable Suzanne Bonamici for providing us with a welcome message. And above all, thank you all, our panelists and participants, for being here and being a part of today's discussion. Give yourselves a round of applause. So Catherine's going to give us an overview of the summit.
Thank you, Elaine. Thanks to all of you for participating today. We're really excited to get this going. But first, logistics. Folks in the room, there's coffee and water back there. The bathrooms are back there to your left. And we will be providing lunch right after the morning session. So about 11:40-ish or so. And at that time, we also will be having the big canoe trip. So if you're interested, please sign up at the registration desk. So we really want to thank the speakers today for being so willing to share their expertise and their experience in advocating for or working with these carbon programs that are so instrumental in not only sequestering carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but also funding or possibly supporting the restoration and conservation work that we all do. To that end, the objectives of this summit are mostly twofold. First, we as restoration practitioners and conservationists consistently try to find innovative new ways of funding our work. And as you all know, being on soft money is a struggle to try to find new ways of funding our efforts. So tracking these kinds of efforts, these carbon programs, can be instrumental in watching how they're evolving over time to help support our restoration and conservation work. Another objective is for us as restoration practitioners and conservationists to understand the role of our efforts in providing that natural climate solutions or in ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Integrate carbon sequestration a little bit more in the afternoon session. And then the morning session is mostly talking about the different kinds of programs that the states are providing. And then lastly, can funding agencies themselves start thinking about or prioritizing restoration techniques and practices that integrate or use these kinds of projects as co-benefits, carbon sequestration, and is the science out there at this point in time to kind of do that, to start prioritizing these kinds of projects and techniques? And not just, so as somebody that consistently writes grants applications for funding, I have seen lots and lots of funding agencies at this point in time integrate climate adaptation questions and rubric in their application. So how projects are adapting to changing climate conditions, but I've yet to see applications ask questions about how much you are doing to sequester carbon and offset those impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to delve into this a little bit throughout today. Our last session is a fast-paced opportunity to talk with the experts and learn more on a one-on-one basis. So this is a great topic, and I know I, for one, learned a lot in speaking with these great panel of speakers. So I learned a lot, and we hope you will too, and thanks for being here with us. So we're gonna hold questions from the panelists. This is a really packed agenda. So we have a question and answer period at the end of each session. So we're gonna hold questions to those, to that timing. And then also folks online, hopefully you can all hear us pretty well. And it sounds like, yes, you can. Please use the chat function in the Teams invitation to ask questions. We have somebody, Doug is moderating the Teams chat so that we can capture your questions of panelists and we can ask them during the question and answer period. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Elaine to introduce our first panel. Nope. Susan.
Hello, everyone. I'm Suzanne Bonamici, and I represent Northwest Oregon in Congress. And I also chair the Bipartisan Congressional Estuaries Caucus and the Bipartisan House Oceans Caucus. Welcome, everyone, to the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership's 2024 Science to Policy Summit. Thank you to the Estuary Partnership for inviting me to speak and for your work to protect and restore the Lower Columbia Estuary. The estuary is really at the heart of the district I represent. It connects communities in the Portland metro area to coastal communities on the North Coast. It's one of the most productive ecosystems in the world, and keeping it healthy is critical for Oregon's economy, environment, and way of life. Estuaries are an essential natural climate solution that filter and absorb water and protect coastal and inland communities from flooding. But the Columbia River and other estuaries across the country are threatened with sea level rise, ocean and coastal acidification, pollution, and harmful algal blooms. At the same time, the climate crisis and warming ocean means storms and flooding will likely increase in frequency and intensity. We must invest in the health of estuaries. And I've been a strong advocate for more funding and research throughout my time in Congress. I'm happy to say that we've made some significant progress in the past few years. The bipartisan infrastructure law included nearly $1 billion for coastal restoration, $200 million for marine debris prevention, mitigation, and removal, and more than $2 billion for investments in port infrastructure, including initiatives to reduce port pollution. The CHIPS and Science Act included My Coastal and Ocean Acidification Research and Innovation Act. This bill will help protect ocean health and provide resources to coastal communities to mitigate the effects of ocean acidification and to strengthen investments in research and monitoring. And importantly, the Inflation Reduction Act includes $2.6 billion for coastal community and climate resilience grants and $200 million for oceanic and atmospheric research. Last month on Earth Day, NOAA announced $123 million in funding for coastal restoration projects, including for projects at our National Estuary and Research Reserves. I've also advocated for funding for estuary research through community project funding. I've secured investments in the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission's Center for Coastal Margin Observation and Prediction during both the 2022 and 2024 cycles. I know there's more to do to protect estuaries and to tap into the potential of blue carbon, which are natural carbon sinks. The high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy found that protection and restoration of coastal blue ecosystems could prevent approximately 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere by 2050. So to leverage the power of blue carbon, we must protect and restore our existing ecosystems as well as increase our knowledge of how they interact with climate change. I'm working to reintroduce my Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act to take these first steps. Create a national map and inventory of coastal blue carbon ecosystems and their sequestration potential. Study the effects of the climate crisis and other environmental stressors on rates of carbon sequestration. Improve protections for existing coastal blue carbon ecosystems, and restore and expand degraded ecosystems. My interest in blue carbon began after conversations with professionals and researchers like those who are gathered at this summit. And I continue to be inspired by the innovative work happening in Oregon, but also across the country. I encourage you to make your voices heard. Help your representatives understand how important it is to invest in blue carbon and estuary and ecosystems to address the climate crisis. I'm hopeful because this is an area with bipartisan support and a growing recognition of the potential of the ocean and coastal climate action. So thank you again to the Estuary Partnership for inviting me to speak, and I hope you have a productive summit.
Excellent. So I will end with the introduction of Congresswoman Bonamici. There's not a lot to add there. She's been a champion of estuaries and the work that happens in the estuaries for quite some time. Many of the science to policy summits that I've been to, she's also been to, either participating or speaking. And every year we're able to engage with her staff pretty much on a continuous basis and herself as she works to learn more about the really important stuff that's happening in the estuary. And I mean, just her words explaining, her level of interest in the science that is happening here in the estuary. It's really commendable, and I appreciate her work and really representing science to policy. She's taking the work that we're doing, she's making things happen in Washington, and we really appreciate that. So an introduction at the end, something different. So now I will introduce our first speaker with a remote presentation. Mike Johnson from the Washington Department of Ecology is going to provide an overview of the Climate Commitment Act in Washington. And I think they're going to cue it up back there. Yep.
Let's see. All right. You should see my overview Climate Commitment Act slide. And how's my audio? Getting some feedback from someone that we're doing okay so far. Good.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you to Elaine. Thank you for Catherine for coordinating. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm a guy from the Upper Columbia, and I've worked with the Puget Sound Partnership. So to be able to speak with you today, representing the Department of Ecology, is a real pleasure. Thank you for accommodating me remotely. I regret that I'll miss out on the big canoe trip, but I also appreciate saving the 4-hour round trip from Tacoma, where I'm joining you from today. So my goal with this presentation today is to give you a high-level look at the program, the Climate Commitment Act in Washington, and how it fits into a broader portfolio of carbon pollution and reduction programs in the state of Washington, and how the CCA is functioning to help meet our climate pollution reduction goals for the state. Here's an overview of those topics that I'm going to cover. You'll hear me say CCA, and that refers to the Climate Commitment Act. Cap and Invest specifically, which is the portion of the CCA that involves the auctions and market, and that's my role with the team, is to lead the carbon auctions. We'll talk about environmental justice, the revenue from those auctions, and where money has been appropriated. We won't talk too much about linkage with other jurisdictions, and then we'll close things up with next steps and what things are looking like in 2024. So the CCA is really the centerpiece of Washington's climate policy, and it focuses on the state's largest polluters. In combination with other state policies, it sets Washington on our path, that steep path downward to reduce our climate pollution 95% by 2050. What the CCA does is create a market-based system for holding the state's largest polluters accountable to ensure that they ratchet down their pollution. Pollution payments are put to work across Washington state to benefit families, workers, businesses, and communities. So in the CCA, the climate pollution is capped and reduced. Businesses that are covered by the program must report their emissions so that we can track program compliance and emission reductions progress over time. So the largest polluters, and when I say largest polluters, I'm talking about those that have over 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions each year in Washington, are required to purchase allowances. So the more that they pollute, the more allowances they must purchase. Over time, the cap on pollution goes down and fewer allowances are made available. So those polluters must find a way to operate even more cleanly. So that's the cap part of the Cap and Invest. Visually, you'll see this is a very steep rate of decline, and that's really one of the hallmarks of the Washington program, especially compared to others around the country. California and RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emission Initiative in New England, are similar programs. The Washington program is designed to really prioritize immediate and substantial reductions, which are necessary to hit our 2050 goals. So to cover the basic structure of the Cap and Invest program, the cap is established, the cap decreases over time. Greenhouse gas emission allowances are issued that are below the cap each year, and they're issued through quarterly auctions or distributed directly to some of the utilities that have a freely allocated allowances to use that they can consign later to auction to be sold by Ecology, and the revenue goes to those utilities for the benefit, to be used for the benefit of ratepayers. So each allowance that's offered allows the emissions of 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent emissions. Businesses covered by the program must attain those allowances and submit them back to Ecology in staggered 4-year periods. We call them compliance periods. Each year, they also have a minimum requirement that they need to hit. So 30% of their total emissions for this year must be submitted by November 1st, and they have some more time through the rest of the year, the rest of the compliance period, to cover those emissions. Allowances that are obtained through quarterly auctions that we host can be bought and sold on secondary markets as well, and traded just like stocks and bonds between the entities that purchase them and others who maybe didn't participate in an auction. And there are limits on the number of allowances that each entity can purchase at auction. So there are some other boundaries on the goings on of participants in the program. Entities can also purchase carbon offsets. We won't talk a whole lot about that today. It's a very small part of the allowances they can purchase. It's 8% of their total emissions in the first couple of years, and that the amount of offsets that they submit to cover their emissions goes down over time to like 6% in the out years of the program. The utilities that operate in the state that receive no cost allowances can consign those allowances to auction. Again, we sell them on their behalf. That revenue is used to benefit the utility customers. So I mentioned covered emissions and what entities that are covered. This term covered refers to those industries or sectors in Washington State, and you can see them on the circle graph there. Electricity and natural gas generation, that's about 30%. Transportation, which is the largest at 35%. And you see other refineries and industrial make up the rest of the 75% of covered emissions. In the future, waste to energy facilities will be wrapped into the program, and then a few years after that, railroads will be included as well. So a little bit of a ramp up time for those two industries. Not covered are the smaller facilities that emit less than 25,000 metric tons of CO2, and then exempt from the program as it stands are agricultural operations, maritime shipping, as well as aviation. And those together with the smaller facilities represent about a quarter of the emission. In Washington State, it's right around 100 million metric tons a year. So basically 75 million metric tons are covered and 25 million are not. Although Washington consistently meets the state and federal standards for outdoor air quality, some communities experience more air pollution than others. Under the air quality and environmental justice provisions of the CCA, Ecology has started work to improve air quality in 16 specific communities, which have determined to be overburdened. The work that Ecology is doing includes meeting with community members, with tribes, with the Environmental Justice Council, which was established to support this work, to expand monitoring, air monitoring network across the state. And it also includes a grant program that we'll be implementing this year to help specifically with these overburdened communities and air pollution in those areas. While the legislature in the state is responsible for selecting which projects are funded with auction proceeds, the CCA includes some specific requirements that ensure that the benefits of the program are enjoyed by all of Washington. So the law specifically directs the Environmental Justice Council to provide recommendations to the legislature on which projects should receive funding. The CCA also requires a minimum of 35% of auction revenue be used for projects that have a direct benefit to vulnerable populations and overburdened communities. And those communities are those that are indicated here on the map. And I'll share a link so folks can explore these maps on their own. I know it might be difficult to see, but those are the areas that are included. It's about 1.2 million people included in those communities across the state. Where Ecology is required to provide the legislature with an annual report on how funding is used, and the program is still very new, and the first of those reports, I believe, is going to be due out this September. So, and then each of September following. So we'll have a complete report of how funds are being used. So to discuss the auctions and market, where the money comes in. So this is a look at the auction settlement prices. Our first auction was in February 2023, and the second auction was in the quarterly. So we had 4 in 2023, and this also includes there's my animation. Also includes the first auction that we had in March of this year. Allowances in 2023, the auction allowance prices started at $48.50 and ultimately peaked at $63, just over $63 before falling back down in the fourth quarter to just under $52. And these types of fluctuations, you see the auction in March 2024 was much lower, and there's some other external factors for that. But these fluctuations are in line with what we expect in the first year of the program as different entities are getting their footing and understanding, just navigating some of the uncertainty that comes with being involved in a new program. So at each of those auctions we've had, there are 5 quarterly auctions that we've had so far, 2 additional auctions that we'll see on the next slide here. These APCR auctions, don't need to know too much about that, but just that they were another auction that brought revenue in for the state. So in 2023, just across the 4 quarterly auctions and the 2 additional auctions that we hosted, there was just over $1.8 billion that was received to the state, and $376 million that went to utilities. So the total proceeds are outlined right there at that $1.8 billion. Now we can look at the use of those funds and how those funds have been appropriated and where they're looking to be spent across the state. So the way that the money, the kind of bureaucratic part of how the money is handled once it comes into Ecology, goes into these separate accounts, the carbon emissions reductions account, climate investment account, and the air quality and health disparities improvement account. And it's from these accounts that grants or programs are funded. And I'll be sharing links to this, or there'll be links available that I can share for folks who really want to dive into some of the specifics here. But the main point I want you to take away is that for fiscal year 24 through 27, auction revenue is forecasted to be about $4.3 billion. The governor's budget 23 through 2025 includes about $3.2 billion in investments that have been appropriated. And we can look at where some of those appropriations exist. The largest amount of funding is for clean transportation programs at just under 40%. So it's kind of off the chart there. You see the break in the chart with clean transportation there. Building decarbonization is about 16%. And then programs to advance environmental justice, promote clean energy development, and enhance climate resilience are each at about 11%. So far, through the first 9 months of July 2023 through March of 2024, the state agencies have spent or committed about over $250 million, about $270 million to different programs and projects. Again, Ecology doesn't directly distribute these funds, but we do collect data on how those funds are used. And as I mentioned, we'll publish those results in September. If for folks who are following along on their devices at home, this short URL here, tinyurl.com/CCA funds, will provide an overview of investments, and I'll put in the chat here at the end of my presentation another place where folks can browse where those investments are happening. So this is a link. Actually, I'm going to share this in chat right now, and we'll give folks permission to wander if you're following along on Teams at least. And for those in the room, we'll have two separate paths here. If folks on Teams want to click the link that I shared there, you can read about, there's a couple of maps, including this map that I'm showing right now, that you can navigate and view on your own. But this outlines the climate-related projects that are currently underway. And you can see each of these different shapes and colors represents different types of projects, from safer routes for walking and riding, foot transportation, heating efficiency, fish passage and restoration, clean energy projects, EV charging stations, and these are broken out by county. So what it looks like, what this appropriation looks like, and I want to again emphasize that this is just appropriation and not yet spending, but where the money is appropriated over the next several years, a big chunk of it is going to be in transportation, this $1.5 billion. And an example of where those funds are going, a large portion of those to electrification of the ferry system, converting existing ferries to hybrid electric ferries, and electrifying Puget Sound, 5 terminals across Puget Sound as well. Some of these funds are matched from federal dollars, so that's a good use of state money and federal money working together. Beyond transportation, again, over $500 million here for clean buildings. That includes $115 million to assist low-income households and money for home electrification grants as well. Home weatherization assistance is another part of that first $115 million. So there's a lot of money out here that exists that's unappropriated that is trying to go from appropriated to being put to use. Specifically around environmental justice, and in this case, environmental justice refers to programs that are specifically targeted to benefit overburdened communities, and that would relate to those communities that are in that map that I showed earlier. There are energy vouchers that are going to be distributed across the state, and those will be out the door by September of 2024. And within that 150 million, there's the equitable access to clean air programs, air quality mitigation in urban areas, community assemblies, participatory budgeting grants, and so forth. Okay, climate resilience, and this might be maybe of more interest to the folks in the room. Specific money set aside for riparian protection grants, tribal climate adaptation grants, fish passage, salmon habitat, climate resilience projects, and also additional funding for the Climate Corps. Agricultural sequestration and methane reduction. There you see a breakout of what that $285 million looks like across those different programs. And then finally, overburdened communities and tribes. Ecology is still working to finalize some of the estimates of the 2024 budget on overburdened communities and tribes, but through each of those last 5 or 6 slides there, I just really want to emphasize there's a $3.2 billion that is appropriated across different types of programs and projects. So the program, the CCA, and specifically the auctions and market program, has generated a lot of revenue. We anticipate another a couple $1 billion over the next few years, and that's great from my point of view as the guy who's in charge of running those auctions, seeing the funds come in and then having them appropriated and then really seeing them put to use and invested is really an exciting thing for me. Okay, so to wrap up and look at some of the next steps, there's just to recap revenues that have been appropriated so far for the current biennium for the state budget. 3 more quarterly auctions this year, in June, September, and December. The first compliance event for those covered entities to turn in allowances that they've been purchasing or trading on the secondary market is due to Ecology by November 1st. Ecology and other state agencies are going to continue to build out our program to accelerate investments. Again, I think it's about $270 million that's been either directly put to use or is ready to be spent on projects. So there's a lot appropriated, but not a lot has gone out the door just yet. And I would encourage folks who have or were interested in exploring funding should look into the state agency grant programs related to projects that they wish to pursue. For example, the Department of Commerce has some clean energy projects that folks could look at. And across the 40 state agencies, I think it is, they all have different amounts of money that's been appropriated. So follow that link that I shared. And folks in the room will get you a link as well, or a way to see where those appropriations are. And then your job would be to go look at those agencies that have funds and then find out what kind of grant programs they have in place and how to get access to some of those funds. Okay, that's all from me today. Thank you again for the opportunity to share some information about the Climate Commitment Act. Again, my name is Mike Johnson. It's been a pleasure to share this with you, and I'll stick around for any folks that have questions. Otherwise, I'll stop sharing here and turn things back over to Catherine.
That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Mike. And I think he's going to be back available to us to ask questions of a little bit later in the morning. Our next presentation is going to be from Catherine Macdonald, and it's going to be another remote presentation. Catherine is the chair of the Oregon Climate Action Commission and a director at the Nature Conservancy. The Natural Climate Solutions Policies and Funding in Oregon is her topic.
Okay, let's see. Can you see my slide here?
I think they're bringing it up.
Oh, looks like it's going away.
It's cascading. It's very exciting. We'll get you back.
You just asked her to just share her presentation window, not her entire screen.
Right. Catherine, can you share your presentation window and not your entire screen?
I'll try to do that. I'm going to stop sharing. Share.
It's fantastic not to have to make people drive all the way here. It's challenging sometimes to make the IT all work together. So thanks for your patience.
Yeah, apologies. So can you
fine.
help me just a little bit? Is it the content screen? I know how to do this on on Zoom, but not on Teams.
Catherine, just share your slide.
Just your presentation. So not your screen. I think there's usually 2 options. Try the content.
Okay. I think that's what I did last time, but I'll try that again.
Catherine, if you open your presentation in full screen and then click the share button, you should be there.
I open it. Oh, here we go. Almost there. Apologies. Now I can see it the way it's supposed to be. Sorry, apologies for this.
Try Alt tabs and then share. So try that and then hit share your presentation.
Alt tabs.
So a three-legged dog walked into a bar.
Uh-oh. Huge apologies.
We have it. Any second, I think we should be able to see it on the screen. Oh, click on PowerPoint, Catherine,
Okay.
and then go to full screen. Oh, we're there. Oh my goodness.
All
Awesome.
right.
Thank you,
Okay,
Catherine.
we're in quite the wrong
Let's get
setting,
everybody
but
sitting down again, and then we'll welcome Catherine virtually into the room with us.
great.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank
Apologies
you.
for
Okay,
not being there and for the technical difficulties.
the floor is
So
yours. Thank you.
I am thrilled to be here. I'm the chair of the Oregon Climate Action Commission, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about the Climate Action Commission's work, in particular, how it relates to Natural and Working Lands Fund as a possible way for you all to engage in having your projects be part of our Oregon climate action work. First, I'll give you just a little bit of background about the commission and our charge, and then talk to you more specifically about the evolution of our work and the Natural and Working Lands Fund. So the Oregon Global Warming Commission, which was the former name of the commission that I chair, was established in 2007. Along with legislation to set sector-based emission reduction goals. And the commission was charged with producing reports to help the legislature understand what progress the state was making towards those goals, to make recommendations for changes in policies and programs to advance climate mitigation in Oregon. And at the time in 2007, that included the land sector, mostly focused on forests. And then our final charge was to educate Oregonians about the risks of climate impacts and the need for climate mitigation. And legislation was passed in 2023 to modernize the commission, including some new members to the commission, as well as a change in our name to kind of reflect our understanding of the issues at the time. So we are now the Oregon Climate Action Commission. We're a large commission for state commissions. We have 13 voting members with expertise in specific areas, as well as at-large members. In addition to the voting members, our ex officio members include 4 legislators, one from each chamber and each party, and then 15 directors from state agencies, plus 3 additional members that we can appoint either from agencies or from academia. And so the commission is really intended to be a place to kind of bring together diverse perspectives and a a diverse assessment of the progress that the state is making and across all the sectors in trying to address climate. So that's the kind of makeup of the commission. In 2020, on the heels of failed efforts over several years to pass a cap and invest program like the one you just heard about from Washington, Governor Brown issued an executive order that provided direction to 16 agencies and commissions to take a number of actions to address climate change and to mitigate climate change. That included an administrative approach to a cap and invest program that the Department of Environmental Quality is responsible for administering. And I'm not going to talk about that today. There is kind of in a similar vein, there is a opportunity for regulated entities to acquire to fund investments in actions that would mitigate climate change outside of their operations. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but happy to answer questions if folks have questions later. The Governor Brown directed the then Oregon Global Warming Commission and now Oregon Climate Action Commission with development of a proposal to suggest to make recommendations about goals for carbon sequestration and storage in Oregon's natural and working lands, and to submit that proposal in the summer of 2021. So in doing that, we took a year to consider what the goals we should recommend would be. We gathered input through a variety of mechanisms from over 1,000 Oregonians. And in the end, we developed the proposal for the governor and the legislature, which included goals and recommendations for achieving those goals. In follow-on work to that, we attempted to pass legislation in 2022. We have short sessions every other year. So in even years, we have short sessions, and we were not successful in passing legislation in 2022. But we were able to do some work to help establish some of the foundational elements of the Natural and Working Lands proposal through funding from the U.S. Climate Alliance and Natural Resource Conservation Service. So we did make some progress. We came back in 2023 and developed a bill to focus in on natural and working lands, which got swept into a broad bill, climate action bill, House Bill 3409. Sections 53 through 67 address the natural and working lands elements of our climate action work. It declares that it's the state's policy to implement and incentivize strategies to advance natural climate solutions, as well as to invest in efforts to improve our understanding of those solutions. It requires the development of a state adopted carbon sequestration and storage goals, and to build out an inventory metrics, data metrics and the goal. So those were some of the foundational pieces. In addition, it funded a workforce study and report, which we are about to launch. It established the Commission's ability to or enabled the Commission's ability to establish a Natural and Working Lands Advisory Committee to help advise the Commission on our work in this important area. And it created the Natural and Working Lands Fund. The fund while much more modest in the potential allocation of funds, we were able to get a $10 million appropriation to in the Natural and Working Lands Fund. 4 state agencies were identified as being eligible to invest those funds: the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and you'll hear more from a staff member of the Enhancement Board following my talk, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Department of Agriculture, and Oregon Department of Forestry. It gave the Oregon Climate Action Commission authority to make the allocations of those funds across the agencies in consultation with and coordination with the eligible agencies, and with input from the public. And then we have reporting requirements to the legislature on how those funds are used, and also some additional funding needs that we see in the future of funding opportunities. The purpose of the fund was to broadly invest in natural climate solutions, to provide incentives, technical assistance, and financial assistance to landowners who are interested in voluntarily adopting new practices. We were encouraged to look at those investments through a number of lenses, including our opportunity to leverage federal funds. From an efficiency standpoint, we were encouraged to look at existing programs first and try and invest through those programs. And then we were encouraged to also look through an equity lens and make sure that we were removing barriers for tribes, environmental justice communities, landowners, land right holders, and managers. So those were the directions we got in terms of use of the funds. The funds, the first block of funding that we received, the commission worked with the agencies in the winter of 2023 and into early 2024 and developed a collective package. That package of investments included distribution across both natural and working lands. It included investments in some immediate actions to increase carbon sequestration, as well as looking at some investments that were more forward-looking, that created some better enabling conditions and or for natural and working lands fund investments in the future. And so it also looked at a combination of on-the-ground projects, technical assistance, and incentives. There were 13 projects that were identified in that first allocation. There were a number of on-the-ground projects, including blue carbon, oak woodland, and floodplain restoration, shrub step restoration, as well as expansion of the seed orchards, tree seed orchards, and collection of seeds as part of the Oregon Native Seed Strategy. And then there were additional investments in more programmatic approaches, including the Department of Forestry's technical assistance, as well as the Oregon Department of Agriculture's technical assistance programs, and then using 2 existing Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board grant programs. One, their open solicitation for conservation grants, and secondarily, in addition, the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program solicitation. So these programmatic approaches really provide landowners and technical assistance providers, such as many of the folks in the room today, to make proposals to get additional funding to advance natural climate solutions in Oregon. In terms of kind of assessing how the original allocation did, in relationship to some of the different areas of investment. We got a very great proposal from the collective agencies that really did a good job of spreading the funds across different systems, connecting with tribes and environmental justice communities, leveraging public funding, and the like. So a great set of proposals. We certainly wanted to get our first set of proposals decided early and as quickly as we could get money on the ground so that we could create a track record that would allow us to come back during our next long session, which starts in January of 2025, to get a second allocation of funding or potentially a permanent allocation of funding. So we're very interested in being able to demonstrate not only the demand, but also the connection from the investments to a lot of the goals that the state has for climate mitigation and the co-benefits that land sector investments can provide. So with that, I'll stop sharing and look forward to taking any questions later. Oh, nice. Did I stop sharing?
So we will come back and do questions after this next presentation. And I want to remind everybody, in the middle of your table, you have a little stack of note cards. And as you're listening to these presentations, if questions pop into your head and you want to be able to, recall them quickly for the Q&A session, just write them down on here and hang on to them after this next presentation. So coming up next is Taylor Larson from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board with a presentation on implementing natural climate solutions using OWEB's restoration and conservation funding, including the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program. Welcome, Taylor. And you can stand here and look at slides, and this mic's work great.
Okay, awesome. Backwards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
And it'll show up here eventually, right? Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here in person. My name's Taylor Larson. I coordinate the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program at the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And so I'm going to be kind of building off of what Kathy was talking about. So how we're at OWEB investing some of those funds from the Natural and Working Lands Fund that came to the agency. And I'm going to have a specific focus and again, do a deep dive into the Ag Heritage Program and how we're making those investments. And I'll touch a little bit on open solicitation as well and be happy to take questions about either. So yeah, just a kind of a little bit of context setting, agriculture in Oregon is quite important for the state. It's a large part of both our rural communities and economies. And it's just a large part of the land base, so having it be one of our, close to 25% of the land base in the state makes it really important that if we're serious about having an impact, both sequestering carbon and just overall ecological function, we need to have an integrated working lands approach. And so that's kind of the goal of the program. And just kind of like thinking big picture, there's just over 20,000 farms and ranches in Oregon, with the vast majority of those being family owned. And so we have this network of basically professional ecosystem managers distributed throughout the state who have skills that have been gained, over decades of experience. And how can we leverage those to make positive change? And just thinking about, over the next 2 decades, there's roughly 2/3 of these farms and ranches are expected to change hands. And so this is both an opportunity for those working lands to come out of production, but it's also an opportunity for those working lands to make positive change. And so the Ag Heritage Program looks to kind of support folks as they're going through that transition to make sure that working lands stay in working lands and that they have the tools available to them in order to, navigate the decades to come. So yeah, like I was saying, the overall purpose of the Ag Heritage Program is kind of threefold. So we have, increase the economic viability of both, specifically agricultural operations, but also the agricultural economy as a whole, while enhancing fish and wildlife habitat, water quality, or other natural resources on Oregon's working land. And that's what we'll actually spend a lot of time talking about. Carbon sequestration is one of those. And then doing so through reducing the conversion and fragmentation of those working lands to make sure that they're available for future generations to be building agricultural businesses and livelihoods on. So kind of the approach that the program takes is making sure that technical service providers and those who work with farmers and ranchers have the resources they need in order to be at the table and help producers engage with change, whether that's transitioning from one ownership to the next, or one cropping system to the next, or implementing a series of conservation practices, and helping folks kind of do the zoom out. As I'm a bit of a recovering farmer myself, and I know it's sometimes hard to zoom out and look at the big picture when you have so many things on your plate and are operating a business that on relatively thin margins. So again, how do we support producers and those who work with producers to take the time to zoom out and focus on those big picture basics? And how do we come with tools? So the tools that we're bringing through the Ag Heritage Program really focus on stabilizing and enhancing the resource base, and then facilitating that transition of farm or ranch land from one ownership to the next, and seeing that as a real opportunity to set folks up for success. So because we're OWEB, the tools we have are grant programs for the most part. And under the Ag Heritage Program, there are 4 main grant programs. So we have our Working Land Conservation Covenant and Easement Program. And this is where we help fund the purchase of conservation easements on farms and ranches. And we really look at this as, stabilizing that resource base. So how do we make sure that generations of specifically Oregonians to come have access to farm and ranch land in order to build agricultural businesses and livelihoods. The program I'll be talking about most today is the Conservation Management Plan program, and this is really focused on enhancing that resource base over a 20 to 50 year time period. So how do we make investments now that's going to set the operation up for success as climate changes, as the economy changes, and as the world changes? So looking at kind of, again, helping folks zoom out, and then stepping in and trying to help make investments. We also have grant programs to support succession planning, as well as just general technical assistance in order to bring projects to fruition. But I won't spend too much time on those, but again, happy to answer questions about them. So as Catherine mentioned, the program received an initial investment from the National Working Lands Fund. So $750,000 is coming to the Ag Heritage Program, and $1.5 million to OWEB's open solicitation project or program. And we're specifically, those are to make grants that fund projects that have a carbon sequestration and or greenhouse gas emissions reduction benefit. And so on the open solicitation side of things, we're in the process at the agency of hiring a water and climate coordinator who's going to lead our public engagement process on that. And hopefully we'll get awards out toward the end of 2024 or early 2025. And similarly, on the Ag Heritage side, we are putting the finishing touches on our methodology for paying for ecosystem services, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And we're going to be engaging in that public engagement process as well. And then hopefully rolling our conservation management planning grants out in 2025. So the Ag Heritage Program, what we're trying to do is kind of bring a unified planning approach and implementation strategy to producers throughout the state. And so, as a producer, you're kind of navigating a lot of different buckets, but you're managing one operation. And so, how do we bring together very similar things? It's natural climate solutions, which are climate smart agriculture is a natural climate solution. And then how do we do that in the context of farm viability? And so this is a little smaller than I thought it would be when I built the slide, but I'll explain it anyway. So this came from Institute for Natural Resources report to the Climate Action Commission around the recommended practices on different land use types throughout the state in order to sequester carbon on natural and working lands. And you'll see, or maybe you won't, there's red stars and black stars up there. Red stars are things that we're able to make investments in through the Ag Heritage Program. Just note that, we're really focused on rangelands and agricultural lands, but we can make investments in blue carbon ecosystems, forest lands, and even potentially urban and suburban lands if they're associated with an agricultural operation. So we wouldn't be making those investments if they weren't part of an agricultural land base or a rangeland land base. And similarly, there's a couple of black stars up there under the conservation. They'll protect agricultural lands from urban or industrialized conversion, prevent conversion of forest to non-forest land, and where's the other one? Tidal wetland conservation. All that to say is that we have an easement program. The natural and working lands funding that came to the program we were specifically instructed not to spend the money on easements, but we have other funding in the program that we can do that. So the conservation management plans kind of at a high level work like this. So there's us as an agency, the Ag Heritage Program. There's a plan holder and there's a plan operator. So the plan holder is the one who would apply to OWEB for the funding to develop and then implement the plan. And then work with the operator who the plan holder can also fund the operator's time to do this planning. To put like I said, a 20 to 50 year conservation plan together that attempts to integrate all of the strategies and potential resources to implement those strategies into one place, and then come back to the Ag Heritage Program when that's done to estimate the ecosystem service value of implementing that plan on a yearly basis. So, yeah, like I was just mentioning, in order to put together a plan, the plan holder works with the operator to define strategies specifically around enhancing habitat, improving water quality, and sequestering carbon, as those are the way that the program mechanics work as far as paying for the implementation of the plan. So once those strategies are developed, the plan holder uses the methodology that we're working on finalizing to estimate the value of those ecosystem services that would be delivered through the implementation of the plan. Again, those buckets would be habitat, water quality, and carbon sequestration. And then there's the plan implementation phase. And so again, they would be working with us as the funder and the operator to facilitate yearly payments to the operator for implementing the plan. That includes a suite of conservation practices that I'll talk about next. So in developing the suite of conservation practices that we could pay for the ecosystem service value, we've been working on putting together a methodology that's rooted in NRCS's conservation practices. We chose this approach so that we're not creating a new suite of hoops for folks to jump through, or at least not too many new hoops. And just trying to, again, streamline the approach that folks are taking to conservation on farms and ranches. So this slide looks a bit confusing, but it's really not. So NRCS has what are called their physical effects ratings for all of their conservation programs or conservation practices. I think there's 165, something like that, conservation practices. And then, like I was mentioning, we were really honing in on the ecosystem service value associated with carbon sequestration, water quality, and habitat. We also looked at soil health, but in the end, we're not making payments for the ecosystem service value derived from soil health, because most of that value accrues to the operator themselves and not society as a whole. And you'll see in the chart, a lot of the soil health practices are also carbon and water quality practices. Yeah, I won't spend too much time getting into the weeds here, but basically we chose some of the physical effects ratings in order to develop a threshold for each one of these buckets of environmental benefit that we care about. And then those that had moderate to substantial improvements in, for instance, sediment runoff or nutrient runoff or aquatic habitat, so on and so forth, were included as eligible practices. So this is a little cutoff, but as you can see, this is kind of the matrix. And so we'll just take, for instance, conservation cover. It's NRCS Practice Code 327, involves planting grasses and forbs and establishing like a permanent cover. And so you see it has a radius, a 5-point scale, 4s for carbon, water quality, sediment, water quality, nutrients, only a 1 in aquatic habitat and only a 3 in terrestrial habitat, and a 5 in soil health. And so it's a little hard to tell, but they're shaded if they're a 4 or a 5 for all of the practices except carbon, which also gets shaded if it's a 3. And that's was our threshold on the 5-point scale for qualifying for that particular payment. This is just the practice list continued. And then this is just a little crosswalk of the carbon qualifying practices. And so you'll see, there are the NRCS practices down in the first column. Their physical effects rating in the second column. And then USDA has, what they call climate smart practices, which are eligible for additional suite of funding opportunities, and then whether or not they were included in the recommended practices from the Climate Action Commission. This is just to capture. So again, we were looking at each one of those environmental benefits: habitat, carbon sequestration, water quality. So for each of those, we did an extensive literature review to try and establish both value and estimated impact per year, per acre, per practice. So here's a table for carbon. It's actually in per hectare, but that's a lot of the literature is in per hectare, so it was easier to keep it that way and then convert it. But just looking across the board to try and get a general estimate of what we could expect per year per practice as far as carbon sequestration. And basically all of the practices ended up scoring either a 0 or a 0.5 or a 1 ton per acre per year. And that would be reflected then in the payment rate. So again, if we're looking at the top conservation for the conservation practice, conservation cover, you'll see there's a 5 in the payment rate per acre per year. And that's because the estimated impact of that particular practice on a per acre basis per year was 0.5 tons per acre. Just to walk through this, you'll see, for instance, conservation cover also gets a water quality benefit, both for sediment and nutrients. Does not qualify, if you remember, it didn't meet the threshold for aquatic habitat or terrestrial habitat. So then the total payment, the ecosystem value per acre is $225, which is a relatively high one. You'll see they kind of range the conservation practices all the way down to $5 for a lot of the carbon-only practices, to a high $485 for riparian forest buffer, which hits all of the buckets. These are just the table continued. So there's 29 total practices included in our eligible practices for the conservation management plan. So that's about 17% of the overall NRCS pool of conservation practices. And the rationale being that we want to catalyze, we have limited dollars. I mean, you'll see there's $750,000 that came to the program. So how do we sort of catalyze those federal farm bill investments and help folks invest in or implement the conservation practices that have the biggest environmental uplift? So yeah, and then in addition to the conservation management plan grants, we make general technical assistance grants that we can also do using the Natural and Working Lands funds, and those are to go to organizations who work with producers to do the legwork it takes to like get somebody to the point where they're ready to put a plan together and implement the conservation plan for the next couple of decades and facilitate a handoff. So that is basically the program. And then I always just do a little plug about things that are coming up in the Ag Heritage Program. So we're currently working on outreach for this funding that we received. Hence I am here, and we'll be in many other places talking about it. We also just recently got some funding into the program through the short session from the state legislature, $5 million that is mostly being invested in the conservation easement program. We have a series of commission meetings coming up this summer. The program's overseen by a commission that does the rulemaking for the program and also makes the funding recommendations to the OWEB board. And we currently have an open solicitation for our conservation easement program. If anybody's interested, it closes June 29th. And then, like I mentioned, we'll be opening the conservation management plan solicitation likely in early 2025. As I mentioned, we'll be doing rulemaking this summer. And then if anybody's interested in getting involved, we have I think in January, we'll have 4 seats opening up on the commission, and would welcome anyone to apply. So please reach out if you're interested. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. I'm done.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. My other day job is a farmer, so I'm like sitting here crunching the numbers. Excellent. So you're welcome to stand up here or have a seat. You'll be sitting virtually with our other 2 presenters. So imagine them up there. And we've got, we're going to have a walking mic over there. I've got a walking mic, and Catherine's going to come up here and try to read people's handwriting. So if you have questions for our first 3 presenters, we will take your cards if you wrote them down on a card, or if you want to just raise your hand, and we will bring a mic to you. I will come grab some cards. I think Jenny from my team. Jenny, would you help us grab cards? Thank you. Got some questions.
I have one that's written. Is OWEB considering adding flowage easements to its toolkit in working land covenants and easements to support floodplain restoration, especially urban systems that benefit environment and people, especially since urban kinds aren't represented otherwise in the program?
What type of easements was it?
I think this is flowage easements in its toolkit in working land covenants and easements.
I'm not sure what a floatage easement is. So, okay.
All right.
Sorry.
Hang on, I'll bring you a mic. If we don't mic you, people can't hear you online. Here you go.
Feeling popular. Flowage easements are a type of conservation easement that are used in the Mississippi system, specifically to reward farmers for allowing their lands to flood during high flood zones, high flood waters.
Flowage.
Flowage. There, I know it's such a crazy archaic word, but they operate differently than conservation easements because you're paying people for the amount of water that they store on their property, but they can still farm and use those lands. They just can't disrupt the water storage capacity of the lands during that process. And I think right now, especially as we're trying to figure out how to do floodplain restoration, how we're trying to manage increasing flooding from climate change, this notion of a flowage easement is to me a very creative way to help bridge investments in ag protection and investments in urban protection from climate change, as well as getting ecosystem benefits out of it. But I have not heard or seen anybody in Oregon using these tools.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up. It would definitely be something that could happen through the Ag Heritage Program through our working lands easements, but it would be up to the land trust to implement or to insert that language in order to protect the floodplain during a particular time of year. But it would not be something we couldn't do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I
So
think
we should, we
the
should
way
talk
I've
more about that.
the way I've heard it referenced here in Oregon in the past is flood easements rather than flowage. But I don't know that it's happened.
Hi, a lot of rangelands in Oregon are federally owned. So how does your program interface with those lands? I'm assuming this is a private landowner program. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so we work sort of in the context. So a lot of folks on the east side have private lands and associated grazing allotments on federal land. And so when what I didn't get into too far is the program mechanics, specifically about how we prioritize our investments. But when looking at, for instance, our easement investments, we take into account the whole operation. And a lot of times folks are looking to place easements on lands that are really important to connect their federal grazing allotment. So our investments go into private lands themselves, but in the context of the overall operation. But yeah, we aren't spending state dollars directly on federal land. Does that answer your question?
I will say that the federal lands probably in Oregon and Washington are part of the land use change and forestry inventory information. So we do track the contribution from federal lands to climate mitigation. Not as part of funding, to Taylor's point, but it is an important part of how we think about the way that the state can achieve our mitigation outcomes and net neutrality, is to consider what the federal lands can contribute.
Thank you. And in the back is our next question.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mike, for the presentation on the CCA. One comment and a question follow-up. As agency staff, Mike's probably told not to mention the ballot initiative 2117 that is aimed at repealing the Climate Commitment Act this year. So important for folks and all your partners to be aware of that, as it would take a major step backwards in terms of the climate resiliency funding that we're deploying in Washington. My question, Mike, is on one of your slides, you showed the auction prices, and the March 2024 had a severe decline in the auction price, and you briefly mentioned some external reasons for that. And I was just curious what those external reasons were.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You mentioned an external reason in the comment. I think that there might be there's a couple things. So there are things outside of the market, politically, economically, that will influence the price that the market determines. Like this, again, these are not prices that we're setting. This is the supply and demand at market. Perhaps there's some entities that are looking ahead to ballot initiatives or similar issues and saying, maybe there's not confidence in this program. Let's not spend a bunch of money on something that might go away. That could be one of the reasons. Additionally, I think that because the again, these are just kind of perhaps maybe entities that are required to purchase those allowances, maybe they've already purchased a sufficient amount to meet their obligations. And so they want to get through this first year and then kind of see how things look in the out years. So the beauty of a market-based program is that it's really set by the participants in the auction. It's not a set price by the state, and the market's going to do what the market's going to do. I think those first years, or the first few auctions through the year, were again kind of higher than were to be expected. Folks are just trying to find their footing. I will mention another policy implication that would perhaps influence that price is that Washington is looking to link our program with California, who already has a linked program with Quebec. Their market is 10 times the size of ours. Their per unit price is in the upper 20s, lower 30s, I think. So aside from I-2117, aside from folks kind of find their footing in or having sufficient supply to meet their compliance obligations, that price of $25.76 per allowance is much closer to what future prices would look like if Washington were to link with California and Quebec in that broader market. And that is our intent to link. The CCA was set up with linkage in mind. So those three factors: linkage, maybe folks have enough, and maybe some folks are shaky about the future of the program.
Thank you. So the next question is from an online participant.
So this is also for you, Mike. How will Ecology continue to assess the effectiveness of the cap and investment program to make sure the state is meeting the reduction goals? And there's sort of a second part here. I'll read that as well. Are there plans in place to address some of the effectiveness questions that have been raised about other cap and trade programs in other states, countries?
Yeah, kind of what does it mean to be effective and how are we evaluating those things? I think in the first years of the program, there's a lot of data collection. Obviously we've successfully held these auctions. That itself was a feat that we've proven to the world and to these other markets and to entities that are required to comply that we can do this. The way that the reductions are set up and the requirements are set up, the cap itself, those emissions reductions are bound by law, and there are serious fines for entities that are responsible for emissions to not hitting those goals. So we expect that the enforcement of those laws and the financial penalties will continue to be a sufficient motivation for companies to find alternatives to fossil fuel use or find ways to be more efficient in their operations. On the other side of that, at the consumer level, at the kind of household or neighborhood level, the way that these investments that, there's almost $2 billion that's ready to be put to use, but to be invested, is meant to reduce the demand at the consumer level. So making it easier for consumers or the public or individuals to change their behaviors to reduce emissions at the household level. So easier to use public transit, making those buses and ferries electric to reduce emissions in that way, weatherizing homes, increasing HVAC efficiency. So the Cap and Invest program has this financial pressure for polluters to comply with the law, and it also makes it easier for consumers to reduce demand for those fossil fuels.
I think some of the criticism that has been levied at cap and invest or cap and trade models, or even carbon tax models, has been that really other things drive the change and not the cap and invest. But that's kind of the intent of a cap and invest program, is to contribute to that overall approach. And so I think a lot of the criticisms are maybe not targeted at the effectiveness of the program itself, or it's more levied at the idea that other things are driving change. And yes, lots of things are driving change. We need everything to drive change. We need all the tools in the toolbox, and a cap and invest program is a critical part of that.
And Catherine, just to follow up on that comment, the CCA and the cap and invest specific, just that auction portion is part of that larger portfolio of programs that the state has. So Clean Energy Transformation Act, the Clean Building Codes, Clean Fuel Standards, which I think Oregon has as well, Clean Vehicles, Builder Performance Standards. So there's a lot from at the government level where there are policies, there are requirements for folks who are operating to be necessary to take actions. That just the way, if you're going to be doing business in Washington, these are the rules now. I'd also say that without the Cap and Invest program, if you have those other programs, you don't have the $1.8 billion that's been raised so far.
Exactly.
So that
Yeah.
money, so along with the portfolio of other programs, we now have revenue to the state, which can be invested back into the communities to help hit those goals, those goals for 2050.
Yeah, a huge opportunity in Washington.
So to follow up on that, Catherine and maybe Taylor a little bit, do you foresee Oregon having some success in some kind of similar program? And specifically, I think there's a question about whether the OHAP at some point will ask or request for a larger allotment.
I'll defer to Catherine.
So the current state program that is designed to administratively address emissions from similar group of regulated sectors is DEQ's climate protection program, and it unfortunately ran into some administrative challenges, and so DEQ is going through rulemaking again on that. There will be funding for investments through that program in the private sector or from the private sector. But those are currently focused more on are not the old program did not identify funding for natural and working lands. It focused more on transportation type emission efforts and building sector emission reduction efforts. In terms of whether we should be including additional funding requests for the Ag Heritage Program or for the Natural Climate Solutions Fund, absolutely. I think there's a huge need to add funding to achieve our climate goals in the land sector. So really hope we can do that. That's going to take a lot of support and some creative funding ideas.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on that. As a state employee, I implement the program and am happy to spend all the money that comes our way.
Okay, Taylor, I think this is aimed at you a little bit. Do you have an understanding of whether the implementation is financially lucrative enough for ag producers to be incentivized to sign up for and implement some of these practices?
Yeah, I think that'll be a really case by case basis, but the idea is that it can be paired with existing federal conservation dollars. So, if a producer is already participating in EQIP or CSP or CREP, for instance, EQIP is paying for the cost to implement, whereas the Ag Heritage Program is paying for the expected ecosystem service benefit. And so for the same conservation practice, it would basically be an additional incentive, and that incentive would be on a yearly basis. So it would be more financially lucrative than it is currently. Whether or not it's going to get somebody to that threshold is going to be dependent on the operation.
Okay, great, thank you. I have another question, and this is, I believe, aimed at Mike. In the climate resiliency funding category, what are examples of eligible carbon sequestration projects? So we saw riparian restoration on the screen, and we missed some of the other ones. So yeah.
I can't answer that directly. I don't know right off the bat. I can share another link here for folks who are on Teams to be able to see. There's a list of projects that are administered through grants that have been applications rather that are proposed projects, and with different grant programs that are managed by the the Recreation and Conservation Office through Washington State. And there are some other salmon projects and land acquisition projects and riparian and targeted investment projects, but sorry, I don't have more information on specifics. We'll have in September, we'll have a report. Sorry for the government answer. Later, we'll have a report for you. But that's kind of where we are right now, being this early in the program. But please follow that link for folks who are interested to see some other examples, the interactive maps there, maybe some inspiration for what types of projects people have supported or applied for some of those funds with.
Thanks. One more question in the back of the room. Does anybody else have any cards or questions? Nope. Great.
Taylor, this is a follow-up question to the whether it's lucrative or not for landowners. How did you determine the value of your ecosystem service payments?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been working with a consultant, Highland Economics, on basically doing an extensive literature review on associated values. So both the expected value and then the expected unit of value delivered per practice, if that makes sense as a distinction. So there's the amount of carbon, let's just use carbon for example. There's the amount of carbon sequestered per year per practice over the lifespan of that particular practice. And then there's the value, and the value question is hard. And so we skewed, we tried to root it in the literature and the latest science, but also skew conservative. And so that, without going into this, the specific methodology for that, I mean, we landed on $10 a ton, which is a pretty conservative value, and that's across the board for both our our water quality and our habitat values. That's rooted in the literature, and then try and skew as conservative as possible.
Right. That, just to follow up on that, because we were exploring that same question in Washington, and one of the things that we're trying to start layering in is what's the value to the farmer. In terms of getting more farmers to adopt these practices, I think we also need to start looking at what's the production loss if they were just farming that same strip of land, and factor that into the value proposition to say, okay, there's the ecosystem services, but if you were growing corn here, how much would that be worth? And can we provide an incentive payment that matches the commodity value of if they were just carrying on as normal? And so, tough question. But
well, yeah, but I think it's a really good point. And the suite of practices we're rolling out through our program are both in-field practices and edge-of-field practices. And so those in-field practices, you wouldn't be taking your crop out of production, you would be producing it in a different way. Whereas the edge-of-field practices, it does need to meet that threshold for a producer for it to be financially viable. But the reason we took the ecosystem service approach as opposed to the revenue given up is so that we can not be, or to the extent possible, not be a double dipping with the federal program. So, for instance, with CREP, that payment that you're getting from FSA is rooted in the value of that particular acre, and so we're paying for what's delivered as opposed to what's being given up. And just so as a producer, you can be thinking about, well, yeah, I produce grass seed, but I also produce clean water and healthy habitat. So.
Great. So we have one other question, and then we're going to go to lunch and a canoe trip, I think. This is an interesting question, connecting Taylor and Catherine's conversations. Is the $10 million that you described, Catherine, through the Oregon Climate Action Commission, is that being used to fund OWEB's Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, which results in the approximately $5 per acre payment for carbon-related conservation practices? So what's the connection between the two programs that you talked about?
I could start and then.
Yeah, go ahead.
So of the $10 million, $2.5
million is coming to OWEB, and $750,000 is going into the Oregon Ag Heritage Program. So it's, a small percentage of the overall fund, but we do have the ability at the agency to play around with those numbers a little bit. But I think that answers your question.
I think that
Well,
did.
and-
Catherine, did you want to add anything?
Maybe just add that there's been an effort to invest in the Ag Heritage Program over the last several years. And Taylor mentioned earlier that this in 2023, or I guess in 2024, the Ag Heritage Program got an additional $5 million bump in the funding. So the program itself is getting funding, and then the National and Working Lands Fund is contributing some additional funding to advance mitigation strategies through working lands. Is that fair? Anything to add to that, Taylor?
No, just to reiterate your point you made during your talk, that you were looking to invest in existing programs. And so that the $10 million was, in order to kind of hit the ground running, was invested into projects and programs that were already in place. So whether or not that's the case going forward, we'll see.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our presenters this morning and everybody who engaged asking questions. It's lunchtime. So we have lunches on the back table. If you had a special dietary restriction, I think the boxes will be marked. We have a canoe trip going. There's 24 people signed up. You're going to meet your crew out here where people are standing around with life jackets on. Probably a dead giveaway that you're going on a boat ride, right? I would suggest that you grab your lunch first. If you're on the canoe trip, grab your lunch first, put it at your place, so that you can make sure that you have lunch when you come back from your canoe trip, okay? Particularly if you had some sort of special dietary restriction that you were had requested in your lunch. So grab your lunch first, leave all your stuff here, go for a boat ride. All the rest of you, the building is yours. There's a fantastic little covered patio. There's beautiful sun out there. Have fun. We'll see you back here at 12:40 on the dot.
Great to be with you. Bye.
Okay. Whoa, that was loud. Everybody, as you come back in, if you've completed your box lunch, there's recycling and garbage right back here. Okay, so where's my paddle people? My Estuary Partnership paddle team. If you were a paddler, express your gratitude for that cool little adventure. I hear they had a maritime mishap while they were out there. So I'm glad everybody came back. Okay, so we're going to start the after lunch session with 2 lightning talks, kind of a slow lightning because they're 7 minutes each. And up first is Charles Seaton from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, CRITFIC. And his presentation is Columbia River Estuary Monitoring and Prediction through CRITFIC Coastal Margin Observation and Prediction Program, CMOP. Come on up, Charles.
Thanks. So I'll be talking about our estuary monitoring program. So the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, CRITFIC, where my program is based, was founded in the 70s by the Yakima Nation, the Warm Springs, Umatilla, and Nez Perce Treaty Tribes to put fish back in the rivers and protect watersheds, protect tribal treaty fishing rights, provide fisher services, and share salmon culture. And the CMOP program, CRITFIC recognized that it didn't have much presence in the estuary, and so acquired the CMOP program in 2020. Before that, the CMOP program, Coastal Margin Observation and Prediction, started in the 90s and started collecting continuous physical data in the late 90s, and then with it actually became CMOP in 2006 as a National Science Foundation center, and began collecting continuous biogeochemical data. So there are 2 sides to the program, observation side and a prediction side. And the the observation side, we maintain an observatory of stations in the lower estuary. We have 5 main stations or 6 main stations, and then a couple that are maintained more intermittently. Some of our stations, we have 2 multi-depth pier-based stations, 1 multi-depth station offshore. The other stations are single depth. And then the observatory measures physical measurements of salinity and temperature at all of our stations. And then biogeochemical monitoring, we measure dissolved oxygen, turbidity, chlorophyll, and a variety of other things related to phytoplankton. And then some at specific stations, we have some more esoteric measurements, mostly some nutrients and others related to phytoplankton as well. And then we have a little bit of meteorological measurement as well. And all of our data is available on our website. So our biogeochemical observations are long enough at this point that we're capable of starting to develop climatologies. So what's shown here is oxygen at 2 of our stations, one in the lower portion of the estuary, we see a lot of salinity, and then one at a little bit higher up where we see only a little salinity. And so we can see the seasonal variations and the interannual variability as well. Some measurements relating to CO2 that we've been that we're starting to do with funding from Congress that Representative Bonamici mentioned. We were able to acquire an instrument called a Berkelator, which is a continuous PCO2, TCO2 analyzer. And so that's installed at our Point Adams station, and we're starting this summer to collect data with that. And then additionally, we are planning to start collecting surface water PCO2 measurements at the Tongue Point station, which is also where the Estuary Partnership supported eddy flux tower that Jonadova manages is located. So we'll be able to get water data on PCO2 as well to connect to that. Moving to our modeling side, so we run the virtual Columbia River, both as daily forecasts and then as hindcast simulations. The animation shows the vertical profile of salinity over the course of a couple of days in the different channels in the lower estuary. For a variety of purposes in terms of identifying the borderlines between freshwater and saltwater habitat. And we've also used the model to support a variety of different metrics relating to salmon. And we can support other measurements that people are interested in. The type of modeling we're doing is hydrodynamic modeling. So we're solving the physical equations describing the motion of water, and they're made solvable by splitting the world into discrete pieces. We do so splitting, our model divides it into triangles and quadrangles in an unstructured mesh, which allows us to represent areas of interest in the appropriate resolution and lower resolution in areas where either less resolution is needed or are of less interest, and then extrude it into the vertical as prisms. And we run these models at a 60-second time step. So every 60 seconds, we evaluate where the water has gone. We're currently in the process of developing a new version of the model. So we'll be developing this year a new database running back to 94 into the current day and rolling out a new forecast. This version of the model has a number of improvements that will make it a significantly better representation of salinity dynamics in the estuary, but will also include high resolution in tidal wetlands, allowing us to resolve the minor channels within the islands and much better represent the dynamics of the wetlands. And then we'll also be incorporating river discharge and stream discharge from the National Water Model, which is a national NOAA-run national model, which incorporates small stream or large streams and small rivers that aren't currently represented in our model. And then we'll be applying all of this to climate change scenarios as well. To finish up, CMOP assets have been used to support regional needs across a variety of methods. So our CMOP stations can serve as platforms of opportunity for monitoring programs and experimental instruments, as we're doing with the eddy flux tower at Tongue Point. And then the modeling can be used to explore relevant scenarios and describe the estuary more broadly than observations are capable of doing, and to look at future scenarios or potential modifications to the system. And we're open to using CMOP capability to support carbon sequestration efforts in the estuary, and I'd be happy to talk with anyone about that if anyone has any interest in looking at how we could do that. Thank you.
Excellent. So next up is Sneha Rao from the Estuary Partnership, one of my colleagues. And the name of her presentation is Bubble Trouble, studying methane and carbon dioxide fluxes in the Lower Columbia River. And I think your slide is up next, Sneha. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I am Sneha Rao. I'm a research scientist at the Estuary Partnership and the monitoring team lead over at our organization. And today I'll be talking to you a little bit about a study where we measure methane emissions from different wetlands throughout the Lower Columbia River. Oh, Lower Columbia River Estuary, sorry. Oh. I'm going to use this. All right, so the wetlands in our region, they're great at providing a lot of ecosystem services. They're very dynamic environments, and there's a lot of research that also shows that they're great at sequestering carbon, that is collecting carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in their sediment. However, as and when we move away from the mouth of the estuary and the wetlands become more freshwater influenced, there is also research that shows that there are a lot of methane emissions that come out from that are emitted in these wetlands. What we don't know, or what is not well studied, is how much of the carbon sequestration potential of these wetlands are negated by the quantity of emissions that are coming from these wetlands. A lot of the restoration projects that are focused in these areas are predominantly focused on improving habitat conditions for ESA listed species like salmon. However, all of these projects don't have a lot of information available on how they're altering the carbon dynamics at these sites. And a lot of this information is required in order for us to prioritize these restoration projects, to be able to call them natural climate solutions, and in order to prioritize them for carbon registries. So over at our organization, our team set out to answer these exact questions. We initiated the soil carbon and methane study, or what we like to call it, the CH4C project. And the main monitoring objective of this project is to assess soil carbon composition, as well as carbon emission rates across different wetlands along the entire estuary. The project has been funded through the EPA under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and we have partnered with Dr. Joe Nidova from OHSU and Dr. Jen Morse over at PSU. We also are working with our folks over at the CMOP program from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, as well as the Cowlitz Indian Tribe. As you can see, the project has multiple phases, and we initiated the first phase in 2023 by installing an eddy covariance flux tower over at Tongue Point. The researchers from CRITFIC really helped us set up this and install this and everything. And this is like a little snapshot of everybody very enthusiastically standing next to these eddy covariance flux towers. Now, if y'all have, I mean, everybody would be wondering, what are these towers, right? So eddy covariance flux towers are basically little weather stations that continuously measure fluxes in greenhouse gases. So in these towers, we're measuring carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. we installed 2 towers over at the sites in Astoria. Here are a close-up of those sites. We have 1 tower over at Tongue Point and another over at Waluski Young's wetlands. This is an 8-year-old restoration project. It is managed by the Cowlitz Indian tribe. And both of these towers provide landscape scale emission, a picture of like the landscape scale emissions. And over at Waluski Young's, early this year, we also installed gas flux chambers. And what that does is it gives us site level information about how much methane and carbon dioxide are being emitted by these wetlands. And this part of the study is being led by Dr. Jen Morse from PSU. We've also been collecting environmental data, that's hydrology, salinity, veg community information. And we're also collecting multispectral data using our Blue US approved drone so that we are able to map all of these fluxes that we're getting on a landscape scale and the site scale over the entire wetland. Once we have initial results of all of these emissions, we plan to move the study design or replicate the study design at different wetlands that represent the entire salinity gradient. Hopefully, we would be able to identify which habitats produce the most amount of methane emissions, how the environmental conditions at a wetland affect these rates. And in the future phases or our last phase, we also aim to collaborate with researchers that have been conducting carbon research over a decade, like the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, in order to create a model that would essentially help provide information about how much methane is coming out of the wetlands, especially the freshwater wetlands, which will then hopefully help prioritize the restoration projects as natural climate solutions and under carbon registries. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to ask for our next panel speakers to come on up. Sit up here. And I am going to load everybody's presentations. And so this is kind of like back-to-back presentations. So we don't really, I'm going to introduce everybody right now. So am I missing Chris? Balance at some point. Okay. All right.
Goes up.
Okay. Yeah. So you're all going to come up here, do presentations, and then sit back down. Okay. And then, so we're going to hold questions till the end, and we have about a 10 to 20 minute, knock on wood, question and answer period. And then after that, we will be doing the expert kind of thing, speed dating of the experts. So this session is focused on folks that have been doing research that underpin the carbon programs that we've been talking about, but then also like dabbling in some of these carbon programs. So this should be really interesting to kind of figure out like what's everybody been doing and trying to figure out how to coordinate and like learn from folks that are dabbling in it. So our practitioner panels is starting with Rose Graves from the Nature Conservancy. Hey, Chris, how's it going? Come on up. So Rose is going to talk about the science of natural climate solutions in the Pacific Northwest. Then Jessica Stahlberger from A New Climate, she's going to give an overview of carbon markets, program participation, and case studies. Then Ian Sings from the Columbia Land Trust is going to talk about their dabbling with conservation-based carbon pilot project that they're doing. Alan Warren from the Bonneville Environmental Foundation will talk about the Carbon Credits Regional Operator Program. And then Chris Collins from the Estuary Partnership will talk about Stagwell Reconnection Project and a case study in emissions and reductions and sequestration. Bios are in your agenda packet, so you can see like a little bit of background information for each of the speakers. With that, should be set.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you all. As Catherine mentioned, oh, they are not. There we go. Thank you. My name is Rose Graves. I'm the Natural Climate Solutions Scientist with the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. In this talk, I'll be providing you with an overview of natural climate solutions, what we know about natural climate solutions in the Pacific Northwest, and what we still don't know. Where are our science gaps? Over the last 6 years, I've been working with the Nature Conservancy in Oregon to understand how nature can play a role in mitigating climate change. I come to this work as a landscape ecologist trained in the science of ecosystems, services, biodiversity, and conservation in social ecological systems. I also come to this work as a mother of a young child, acutely aware that in order for her and her peers to have a livable future, we need all hands and all tools on deck to combat climate change. And so perhaps it's no surprise that I'm now settled in on natural climate solutions, because natural climate solutions are actions which lead to reductions in greenhouse gases and store carbon. And these, the natural climate solutions concept builds on a long history of conservation science. So we're talking about the actions that we do naturally when we think about conservation. It's talking about restoring ecosystems, we're talking about conserving ecosystems, and we're talking about better managing our ecosystems. However, the natural climate solutions concept takes this long history of conservation science and practice and really focuses on a framework for measurable climate change mitigation. Global science shows us that natural climate solutions can provide globally significant climate mitigation through avoiding these emissions and storing more carbon in our lands and waters. This will help us avoid the worst effects of climate change while also supporting communities, thriving ecosystems, and biodiversity. Indeed, most of our global science also shows us that we can't do it without nature. Nature is critical to meeting really important climate mitigation goals to avoid climate catastrophe. That will require immediate natural climate solution action implemented in an equitable and sustainable manner. This slide, I'll explain just a tiny bit because you can't see the citations on here, but this is from a study that was done by TNC scientists that looked at the global potential for natural climate solutions. And you see it kind of breaks it down into a couple different categories. I don't focus too much on the actual numbers here. Models are models. We're always learning more. We're always improving our science. And you heard a couple examples of that just now. But really, we're looking at protecting forests, wetlands, grasslands, managing timberlands, croplands, grazing lands, and restoring forests and wetlands. And altogether, we estimate that globally, that can get us to about 11 gigatons of CO2 of climate mitigation. I will always say this in all my talks, nature can't do it alone. We are looking here at the bathtub model of the atmosphere. So you're looking at CO2. We talk about greenhouse gases in CO2, carbon dioxide equivalents, but we can think of that as CO2 and other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. There are two kind of primary sources going into the atmosphere, into this bathtub. One of those is natural, kind of from our natural climate, carbon dioxide, methane emissions. The other one is the man-made CO2 emissions tap. And really, we need to turn that one off in addition to investing in our natural and working lands. Of course, climate mitigation is only one of many ecosystem services provided by these natural climate solutions and the actions to restore, conserve, and better manage our ecosystems. We can also see kind of This is a beautiful slide by a woman named Erica Slotnicker, which I love because it kind of brings it home to the Pacific Northwest in some ways. We see some of those very specific other benefits of this work that can help us to lead to thriving natural and human communities. Here in the Pacific Northwest, scientists with the Nature Conservancy have explored the potential for natural climate solutions to contribute to the greenhouse gas mitigation goals for both Oregon and Washington. These studies have used scenarios of natural climate solution implementation, where each scenario adjusted land use and land management by some percentage relative to business as usual. And then calculated the simulated greenhouse gas emission reductions over the period up to mid-century, up to 2050. You can sort of read what's, oh, I guess you can't fully read that. So reducing forest and grassland conversion, increasing restoration and reducing conversion of sagebrush steppe ecosystems, extended harvest rotations in our forests, reducing nitrogen fertilizer emissions, cover crop no-till, increased riparian forest, restoration of riparian forest cover, increasing replanting after fires, and increasing tidal wetland restoration. There are other practices that could be included in this. At the time that we were doing these studies, we were looking at where the best available science was and what we had reliable estimates to be able to include in our scenarios. So in 2020, we published this study, this pathway, in collaboration with Portland State University. I was a postdoc at Portland State at the time. And we compared the climate mitigation benefit of those scenarios for Oregon. Really, the big take home here is that those actions, when taken together, natural climate solution can get us closer to our net zero, really what we need to have as targets to get to net zero to mitigate climate change here in Oregon. In Washington, they also found that ambitious implementation of natural climate solutions could lead to somewhere between 4 and 8 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year by mid-century. And so that's an annual emission reduction of approximately, well, I had it somewhere, but some number of cars off the road, and we can look that up in the EPA, but between 4 and 9 million metric tons per year by mid-century. In both Oregon and Washington, we found that forest management, protection, and restoration, including the restoration of riparian forest cover, have the highest potential climate mitigation. Those are the activities that can get us the fastest, most highest magnitude climate mitigation. Tidal wetland conservation and restoration also have pretty high per unit area climate mitigation, with some caveats that Sneha mentioned earlier. And I think one of the points on this slide that I wanted to make really was that one of the things that the Washington study did that was really interesting to me, and you can't see super well because you can't see the outline of the state as well, is that this mapping really shows that even with those activities, those natural climate solutions that might have lower overall cumulative potential, thinking about equitable and evenly distributed benefits from these requires thinking about areas where they might be clustered and you might actually have higher benefits from a particular activity in one part of the state versus another. We've tossed a bunch of terms out at you in the last couple of talks. Some of you come into this knowing what all those terms mean. Some of you might come into this saying, I just heard some words and I'm not sure what those mean. So I'm just going to try to get us all on the same page here. Some important terms to know and think about when you're thinking about natural climate solutions and when you're thinking about climate mitigation in general are carbon stocks, carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas flux, and net sequestration. So carbon stocks, what is that? That's how much carbon is stored in a place at a time, in a pool of carbon. And we talk about pools of carbon as reservoirs where that is stored over time. That can be something like the soil. It can be the trees in a forest. It can be the crops that they're stored in. Every piece, anywhere where carbon is stored, and the atmosphere even is a pool of carbon. So there are stocks of carbon, how much carbon is stored there. Carbon sequestration is the process of capturing and storing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into one of the terrestrial or other carbon pools. Greenhouse gas flux, how much greenhouse gas is exchanged between those pools at any one point in time. And net sequestration is the balance of those greenhouse gas fluxes at a point in time. So a greenhouse gas flux might be methane emissions. Another greenhouse gas flux would be carbon sequestration. In order for something to have a net climate mitigative benefit, you want the sequestration to be higher than the emissions. Kind of thinking about it as your bank account. You want your income to be higher than your outflow. And that'll build your stocks up over time. So when we think about in natural climate solutions, we want to think about quantifying and conserving those existing carbon stocks, measuring and enhancing natural carbon sequestration, measuring and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and determining how carbon moves among ecosystems. So how is that carbon moving among the various pools? And how can we manage that? For those of you who like diagrams, this is what that can look like in an ecosystem as we start thinking about it, moving from being stored in things like the trees, the above ground biomass, going into the soils. You can think about carbon moving all throughout this ecosystem. And when we think about natural climate solutions and the science of natural climate solutions, we have more certainty in some of those aspects than we do in others. I'm going to walk you through this graph a little bit because it's very teeny tiny. You don't necessarily need to know what's exactly in each of those dots. But this is a study that was published by a man named Brian Bouma and his colleagues recently this year that ranks different natural climate solutions along axes of uncertainty and climate impact, right? So this axis on the left-hand side here is the higher uncertainty is actually at the bottom. So those down there we aren't as certain about their impact. We don't know if the evidence base really exists there. And then up to lower certainty, we have a lot more confidence that those are truly natural climate solutions. And then the climate impact. To orient you, because I know that you can't read what's on there, I'm circling the ones that we might care most about here. So forest-based natural climate solution activities generally cluster in the lower uncertainty, higher climate impact. There's a pretty wide range along that. Tidal wetland restoration, and then those two other bubbles are freshwater wetlands, and then sort of our agricultural cropland, et cetera, landscape is in that kind of yellowish bubble there. So we can see that many of our natural climate solutions have strong evidence, and some of them have medium evidence, right? We want to start thinking about filling in those science gaps to better understand both the directionality and magnitude of those natural climate solutions. So some things are uncertain, but what do we know? We know that natural climate solutions can provide critical climate mitigation when they're coupled with fossil fuel emission reductions. For some activities, the magnitude of that climate mitigation is still uncertain, but we also know that the natural climate solution science is evolving to better understand how these benefits vary by location and over time. Some examples of that are blue carbon ecosystems. So in the Pacific Northwest, the Blue Carbon Working Group has led tremendous and long-term and ongoing work to understand the potential climate mitigation benefits provided by conservation, management, and restoration of our coastal ecosystems. That work has illustrated that in most of these ecosystems, most of the carbon is stored in the soils, so that remember, if we go back to my definitions, that's the carbon stocks are stored in the soil carbon pool. In some cases, these carbon stocks rival and exceed the carbon stocks stored in the Pacific Northwest's forests. This makes a case for limiting the loss of these systems, which would lead to the loss of those carbon stocks and the eventual emission of those carbon stocks into the atmosphere. The Blue Carbon Working Group, along with others, are also really trying to dig into the third point here on this slide, that blue carbon ecosystems are complex, and that depending on their location and management, they may be greenhouse gas sinks or sources. And this is especially important when we start thinking about the restoration of these systems and the time it takes for that carbon sequestration to be higher and that carbon stock buildup to be higher than the emissions. I do want to add just really quickly to keep your eyes open, your eyes and ears open, because there is soon to be released a blue carbon calculator developed by the Pacific Northwest blue carbon experts, led by many of them, but Craig Cornu comes to mind as the person who's leading a lot of it. This calculator is going to be really helpful for practitioners because it's going to allow you to put in a project, and they will have built the tool so that you can say, I have this many acres that I'm restoring from this condition, or I'm going to conserve this many acres, and it's going to tell you, using the best available science, what the climate mitigation benefits could be from that project. So keep your eyes open for that. Another example that I'll just highlight here is the restoration of riparian forest cover through planting or maybe through natural initiation can have really high carbon sequestration. The global studies and studies from other regions show us that planting of these forests can, maybe unsurprisingly, accelerate the carbon sequestration and biomass in these forests. We can be fairly confident that restoration of riparian forest cover will lead to climate mitigation benefits, but these forests are less well studied in the Pacific Northwest than their upland counterparts. And so we're a little less certain about what that climate mitigation magnitude might be. To address that science gap, we've partnered with the University of Oregon, OWEB, and Clean Water Services to evaluate above ground and soil carbon stocks at, I think by the end of the summer, we should have about 50 sites that have been where riparian restoration with plantings, so restoration of forest cover projects have been implemented between 5 and about 30 years ago. These data will help us to better estimate the carbon sequestration benefit from those plantings, but those gaps will still remain regarding potential greenhouse gas emissions and how carbon moves from those riparian systems into other systems. Yeah. I do want to leave you on sort of a summarized version, slightly different version of the recommended and emerging practices for natural climate solutions in the Pacific Northwest. Just so that you have a sense of, if you were going to go out and do something today, where would your high confidence practices be? And where I think we can land pretty solidly on this collection of recommended practices and some emerging practices. The asterisk refers to this down here. So you'll see that even on some of those ones that are up there, the restoration ones in particular, we don't really know yet what the timeline is for some of those benefits. Salinity matters. Inundation and flooding frequency are probably variables that we want to understand better to fully understand the magnitude of those. Yet I think we can confidently move forward and say that if we're moving into those spaces and we're incentivizing those as natural climate solutions, great, you can feel good about the work that you're doing and the climate mitigation benefit that it probably has. And with that, I'll close and pass it on to Jessica.
Hey. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. Well, it's good to be here with everyone today. I'm Jessica Stahlberger, and I've been with the New Climate for over 7 years now. I'm not a scientist. I manage our client success team, and we are the ones that are tasked with working with all of our clients across our entire portfolio of renewable natural gas, carbon, and electric vehicle projects. And so we really work to liaise between the technicians and the scientists and our clients, and the public to some degree to interpret everything. So I live in Salt Lake, but I'm from here, so it's nice to have an excuse to come back and be here with you all. In the time that I have today, I'm going to do my best to provide an overview of what's involved in and required to participate in a carbon program. I'll provide a brief history of kind of the markets, the voluntary and compliance markets, as well as speak to a little bit of the future outlook of these markets, including where the demand is coming from on the buyer side. And I'm going to end with a few examples from our current portfolio of natural climate solutions projects. So before I get too far into it, I want to just introduce a new climate and what we do. It's a little bit challenging to talk about what we do sometimes. It's not really dinner table conversation. And I always, I'm trying to convince my kids or tell them what I do. So anyway, but it's the result of a merger of two of the biggest companies with very long history in the environmental commodities markets. Blue Source was the company that I was with originally, and we're one of the oldest and largest project developers in the North American carbon market. So obviously US and Canada. And we were around for about 20 years before, I'll move on, 20 years before we actually merged about 2.5 years ago. Element Markets has a very long history as a project developer and marketer of renewable fuels and emissions credits. So together, we're actually the largest marketer and developer of high quality carbon offsets and environmental credits in North America. Through our project development, we create climate impacts by reducing carbon emissions, replacing fossil fuels, and removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. And many of our projects in natural climate solutions, sustainable agriculture, help us achieve these impacts. Let's talk for a few minutes about why our buyers are interested in carbon offsets. On the voluntary side, it's because they need them in order to address their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Primarily, their most valuable, voluntary offsets are most valuable in addressing scope 3 emissions because those are the ones that are generated from indirect sources outside of a company's direct control. And so they are some of the most difficult to address without voluntary offsets. And Anu specializes in developing these on the voluntary side and the compliance side, of course. And we work with our buyers to help identify their needs and then go ahead and match them up with projects that are suitable for helping them achieve their emissions reductions target. In developing these, on the voluntary side and the compliance side, of course, and we work with our buyers to help identify their needs and then go ahead and match them up with projects that are suitable for helping them achieve their emissions reductions targets. We work with all of the major registries, including the American Carbon Registry, Verra, Gold Standard, and Climate Action Reserve, of course. So a little bit about the voluntary side of it. I'll kind of go back and forth between the two markets, but on the voluntary side, recently, over the last couple of years, credits have actually been bifurcated into two types, and these are avoided emissions, which are also sometimes known as conservation credits, and removals credits. And the avoided or conservation emissions are those that are generated from activities that otherwise would release carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. And in the case of like an improved forest management project, for example, the credits are generated through the avoidance of the removal of trees. In the same example of an improved forest management or say a grasslands project, the removals credits are generated by what's actually left on site and the growth of that year over year. So an improved forest management project, the conservation of the trees results in conservation credits, and the growth of those trees year over year results in removals credits. It's worth noting that the same distinction isn't exactly the same in compliance projects. There are different types of credits in compliance projects as well, but all of these credits transact at different price points in the market, and they do fluctuate based on supply and demand. So in any project type, a project has to demonstrate that the credits produced from it meet 5 very important criteria. And these are real, additional, verifiable, enforceable, and permanent. And I'll just kind of go through them really quickly, but real essentially means that they can be accurately measured according to scientifically based protocols. Additional means that it has to be demonstrated that they're generated in a beyond business as usual scenario. Rose alluded to that, and that's very important to be able to prove that. Verifiable means they can be independently reviewed and verified by a third party. Enforceable means that the entity that ultimately claims them as a final reduction against their emissions is undisputable, and so there can be no double counting of offsets. And permanent means they can't be reversed. So any potential reversal of credits is actually accounted for in a buffer pool, which serves as like an insurance pool of credits for insurance policy against the reversal. And buyers are not the ones that take risk for that on. It's actually a risk that's assumed by the registry and the project developer to a certain degree. So it's really important to note that the registries make the rules and the protocols enforce these rules. And that's across the industry. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the demand side of it. We've talked a little bit about the compliance programs earlier, but the compliance markets are really comprised of obligated parties that are trading and surrendering carbon allowances for emissions. And it includes companies that are obligated under, as regulated entities under certain cap and trade programs. Demand in this market has been consistently growing over the last several years as more and more entities fall under cap and trade programs. The voluntary market has also seen a lot of growth over the last several years. It's different in that it's made up of a wider variety of players who are voluntarily setting and achieving their sustainability and emission reduction targets. Overall, demand has been on the rise in the voluntary sector in recent years due to several things, and I'll just touch on a couple of these in the interest of time. But one of those is increased commitments by corporations to their own carbon neutrality claims and net zero claims, as well as just a greater emphasis on corporate sustainability and ESG. There's a lot more universities and colleges that are working to meet decarbonization pledges, and then of course, aviation demand through CORSIA is another reason for this increase in demand. So there has been steady rise over the last several years, but the last couple of years has seen a little bit lower liquidity in the voluntary sector as buyers have become more savvy and educated. I need to grab my water. Okay, thanks. So voluntary buyers are now going to greater and greater lengths to do their own due diligence of projects, whereas that used to just not be quite as common. I think probably most people in this room are aware of a lot of the media scrutiny that has happened over the last couple of years, and that's really played a very large role in the pullback and scrutiny on the part of buyers as to the value of these credits. And a lot of that has focused on the additional or additionality component that I talked about a few slides back, but that importance of, being able to demonstrate that the credits are generated in a beyond business as usual scenario. And this is where it's really important for ANU as a marketer of these credits to help educate our buyers on the value of what a high quality project is and how the carbon revenues are important in the enhancement of the land and the stewardship and conservation efforts and how those really are impactful. We have been working with a lot of other market players over the last several months to try and address some of this market uncertainty on the part of buyers and trying to find additional ways that we can educate buyers on high quality offsets. One of the steps that we've been taking is actually integrating new remote sensing technology and satellite imagery into our program. And this is going to be helpful for us in helping address a lot of this uncertainty that has been going on and in creating greater market certainty, by creating a better educated pool of buyers in this space. Ultimately, we see this pullback as a good thing because the more that buyers are aware and the more educated they are and the more savvy they are, that's going to benefit in a more robust market. And when there's a more robust market, it means there's more impact on the ground and we all benefit from that. I'll just go to this slide really quickly. This is just a slide that represents who some of our project partners are on the development and buyer side. You can see we've worked closely with the Nature Conservancy for many years as project partners in developing a lot of improved forest management projects. But I will say this list really is representative of partners that we work with on in both the compliance and voluntary markets. So I won't spend too much time there. I'll talk kind of quickly about, well, this slide's quick. The steps in developing a carbon project. So it essentially consists of kind of 3 steps or phases, but the first being a feasibility study. Second, credit development, of course, and then the marketing and sales, which is a very long-term ongoing process. I think the second step is probably of most interest to this group today. So I'm sorry, well, yeah, actually you can see it okay. I'll spend a little bit of time just focusing on this one. It really starts at the time of contracting, and it takes about a solid 24 months at least to develop a natural, like an NCS project from contracting to the time credits are available in the marketplace for transacting. So once we contract with someone, or somebody like us, the project gets submitted to a registry for review and approval. And this is where the documentation from the feasibility study is reviewed and vetted. And then once the registry reviews that and approves it, it's listed. And that's when we move to a forest carbon inventory. And that takes about 6 months. And this is just what it sounds like. It's where we're completing an inventory of the property. Some of this is done remotely, but there's a big part of it for us that is actually done on the ground where we work with our third party and partner inventory crews to verify what's on the ground is what we're seeing remotely. After that, it moves into the modeling and documentation phase. And that's where the technical team is working to model the property in comparison to that baseline scenario. And once that's all documented and prepared, it moves into the verification phase. And this is really the most time consuming part. 9 months is pretty standard for that right now. And it's really because there's a lot of back and forth between us and the verifier and confirming that those long-term credit projections are accurate and ready to be submitted to the registry. So once they have completed, the verifiers completed their review, it goes into like a final technical review. And that's where a senior lead verifier writes up the final report, which ultimately gets submitted to the registry. And this usually takes a month or 2. And then once everything is submitted to the registry, credits are issued and they're available in the market to transact. But from that point, there's still a lot of ongoing monitoring and management of the project that's required as a long-term commitment. And credit sales are ongoing and long-term, and that's where our marketing team, sales teams are working to match projects with buyers and fit their needs. So for both compliance and voluntary projects, there are many long-term commitments that are required of a landowner. Most importantly, the landowner has to maintain the initial carbon stocking and carbon stocks that are tied to those credits by cutting no more than the growth that occurs annually on the property. They also have to be certified by FSC, SFI, or the American Tree Farm System if there's any cutting taking place on the property. And then, of course, the long-term monitoring obligations must be completed throughout the commitment timeline, which is 100 years for compliance projects and 40 for voluntary. So obviously very long-term commitments, especially for compliance. For compliance, there's a few additional commitments that are worth noting. I won't go over all of them. I think you can probably see them well enough, but the property has to have greater than 95% species, native species on the lands. And there's no clear cutting above 40 acres. There's a requirement for 300-foot buffers between even aged harvest units. And there's no harvesting of adjacent stands more frequently than every 5 years. So all of these are a bit additional beyond what a voluntary would be. But all of these are really significant commitments when, you know, you're talking about a landowner setting aside other revenues that they could be utilizing from the property. Currently, ANU has over 110 registered forest carbon projects that make up about 6 million acres of protected land. And to date, we've generated about $182 million in revenue for our landowners. And as you can imagine, a majority of that gets reinvested into management, conservation, and stewardship of the land. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about a few projects from our current portfolio. And both of them are in Washington. The Rainier Gateway Forestry Project is located just in the foothills of Mount Rainier, and I got to go up and do a site visit on that one a few years ago and see for myself the difference in forest management practices between that one and the neighboring properties. And I won't name any names, but I'm sure you can imagine they were starkly different. So a few stats on it. There are 3,200 acres protected with that project. And as just kind of a sidebar, that's that's basically the minimum acreage that you need in a well-stocked forest in order to participate in a carbon program. It contains 22 miles of shoreline, and then there are 9 identified threatened species within the project boundaries. This project has a pretty cool story. It really required a lot of coordination of multiple stakeholders involved to come together. And the lands are actually owned and managed together by the Nisqually Land Trust and the Nisqually Community Forest. The revenues that are generated from the project are used to help support the ongoing land management, which, as we all know, is very resource heavy. And especially, you know, in this neck of the woods. I was talking with Joe Kane, who's with the community forest recently, and he was just expressing to me that, you know, most people don't realize how much is involved when you're transitioning a property out of traditional industrial management to ecological health. And the community forest is actually using the carbon revenues to help support that transition. And they have an organizational goal to support operations and stewardship costs entirely from forest sector revenues rather than traditional nonprofit fundraising. They've deliberately designed the Nisqually Community Forest to not compete with other area-based nonprofits so that they're not all drawing from the same pool of limited donor funds within the watershed. They've been quite successful at achieving this, and the carbon revenues have gone a long way in helping them meet this goal. In particular, the revenues have been really critical for supporting a full-time executive director position, which is essential for them meeting their organizational goal of becoming a 20,000 to 30,000 acre community forest. And last, I kind of want to tee it up for Ian Sinks with Columbia Land Trust. They're a project partner of ours as well, but I'll just kind of introduce another project and talk really briefly about it. But this one is located very near here. And it's located on actually several different properties. We didn't quite reach the final number the other day when Sherry and I were talking, but it's like 12 or 13 different properties, which it's quite a complicated project, actually, but it's really an impactful one. There are 13,000 acres spread out over several properties, but 7.8 miles of riverfront. And what is unique about this is that they are utilizing and setting aside 90% of the carbon revenues to be reinvested and to purchase additional lands for conservation. And my understanding is there's a focus on coastal forest lands, which, as we all know, have, high carbon value. And so, yeah, I'll turn it over to Ian. Thanks for letting me share about what we do, and happy to address any questions in the next session.
Hi, it's nice to be here. I am Ian Sinks. I'm the Stewardship Director for Columbia Land Trust. For those of you who are not familiar, we're a nonprofit land conservancy operating in the lower 200 or so miles of the Columbia River in both Oregon and Washington. Central to a lot of our work is natural climate solutions. We have conserved about 65,000 acres in our region. Most of that is habitat land, but we also work in working forests and farms and nature close to home. Green spaces. We also participate in the Portland metro area backyard habitat program, which you might be familiar with. So the natural climate solutions are really central to a lot of what we do. We conserve land from the estuary to the shrub steppe. We do a lot of management, restoration, and of course, protection is at the heart of our work. I'm going to just talk really briefly today about our pilot carbon project. So, when we think about the work that we do, we protect forests, we restore land, we plant tens to hundreds of thousands of trees in any given year with our restoration projects. We manage forests. We use prescribed fire to reduce, fire risk that release more carbon ultimately. But when we think about our forest conservation program, we know that all of the work that we do has a climate benefit, and we often have said it's like, well, we are doing, we're solving all of these kind of ecological and conservation needs, but we're also addressing climate. But we also know the urgency is here for us to do more as much as possible. And forest conservation is kind of complicated. It's harder to find funding for it. And so we started working several years ago to look at a carbon credit program that can generate revenue. And as Jessica mentioned, our board dedicated 90% of any revenue that we get towards more forest conservation. That's how we felt and feel good about us being able to move the needle while funding more of the conservation work that is already a priority for us, but also helps really address the climate issues. So I'm just going to kind of go through this fairly quickly. Our pilot project, we had three kind of goals articulated. One is that we want to kind of embed carbon into our forest management, in addition to our conservation management, wildlife management. We want to be thinking about carbon. We want to, help mitigate climate, and also give organizations, and we ended up working through the voluntary market, a chance to, to raise awareness and participate in climate mitigation in lands close to home. So a lot of the carbon projects, at least historically, maybe that's changing a little bit now, were, across the country or across the world. And here we can work with entities looking to offset their carbon impacts, within the region. You can actually drive by and see where you're having an impact. And again, we want to reinvest the revenues for more carbon sequestration and conservation. And so it helps us accelerate what we're trying to do on a landscape level in our region. So what does it look like? It is about 13,000 acres, slightly more. It is scattered throughout our region. This is our region that the Land Trust works in. Our main office is here in Vancouver. So we've enrolled or are working on enrolling 13,000+ acres on forests, and I'll describe just a couple of them. We did contract with Anu to conduct all the due diligence, the verification and marketing. And we have a contract with them for 12 years, I think, but the whole registry is 40 years, and we have a chance to renew that when we get to that point. I think important to us, we also were able to work with Anu and the American Carbon Registry to pre-sale market some of our credits to partners close to us. And so, for example, our financial advisor bought into a pre-sale market of these credits, and then it's gone on the open market. But even when Anu is working to market those credits, we were able also to put some sidebars on that. And so we chose as an organization not to participate in petroleum industry buying of our credits. We wanted to offer it to other industries. And that also kind of all kind of built into what we felt was important. And again, we are reinvesting these revenues into more forest conservation. And we have targeted the coastal high biomass forests. One, because they're our conservation priority for wildlife and watershed processes and communities, but also because they pack a lot of carbon pretty quickly. Jessica covered some of this, but we're looking at the delta between kind of standard practices and what our ultimate management is. We also have, because we're working with lands that have already been or are in the process of being conserved, we need to look at, and they are doing a lot of due diligence around verifying what our baseline is with those encumbrances that have come with grant funding or donor funding or other restrictions. And so that's all built into the calculations. There is that inventory, and then there's our look actually, at all the additional benefits that come with, buying credits from these lands. And of course, these are conservation lands, so it's fish and wildlife, it's nature and other benefits, ecological or ecosystem services. And that all kind of plays in, maybe not on a one-to-one basis with the market, the carbon credit sales, but it's that kind of additional value. Which all of this doesn't mean that we can't manage our forests. And so we have bought lands that we are, maybe these pictures ought to be reversed, but some of the lands, the forests that we've purchased are, we're buying and we're protecting. We're monitoring and maintaining them, but we're really not doing anything active. Nature is taking care of itself. It already has big trees and a lot of value. But most often we are able to buy recently cut over land or younger plantation stands. And these are very simplified habitats. They're kind of dense, they're field loaded, there's not a lot of diversity. And so we are doing forestry, conservation oriented forestry, and that looks like the photo on your left, which is, we're working in, we're thinning, we're trying to enhance the structure and growth, but also increase the diversity and composition of these forests. Simply said, we're taking a plantation and turning it into a forest again. But all of that harvest is built into the calculations on the credits. And so we can't go below a baseline, but we don't. We're trying to grow bigger trees faster that are more structurally diverse. And that's what conservation forestry does. We can have a whole nother session just on conservation forestry. Maybe we should at some point, but anyway, I'll leave it there. So just a quick look at some of our properties. One, this is kind of in the Vernonia Rainier area. It's 640 acres. It was donated to us. It's kind of, this photo doesn't quite show it, but it's in kind of that big sea of clear cuts and industrial forest lands in the beginning of the Coast Range. And it's kind of a gem. It's fully intact, almost weed free, 80-plus-year-old trees. You can see, maybe you can see on that photo, they did some patch cutting 20 or 30 years ago. And so for the most part, we are doing no management here. And the kind of carbon stocks are about 478 tons of carbon per acre, which is pretty high. Just don't quote those numbers. I think those numbers have been, yeah, I felt the nervousness over there. These are rough preliminary numbers, and we're still working on, but it gives you a sense of what these different forests look like and what kind of carbon stocks they have. Pine Creek is an area that we've been working. It's 2,500, 2,400 acres. It's just south of Mount St. Helens. It has been industrial forest for quite a while. It is a mix of early plantation and 20, 30-year-olds and some older trees. We are doing conservation forestry here, and you can see that the carbon inventory is a bit lower at 150 tons per acre. And then moving further east, up in the upper Klickitat, right on the edge of the Yakima Indian Nation Reservation, or actually this is technically in the reservation. We have 4,000 acres that we've conserved, and you can see this is kind of a drier east side, slightly higher elevation, oak pine, fir, woodland, and it's down to about 100 tons per acre. But all of this is brought together in a much more complicated process than I'll kind of be able to go through here. to work and for us to advance our carbon credits. Some quick lessons learned is that this process has integrity. I've been impressed personally because I worry about, monetizing nature and carbon credits, and are we really moving the needle? But I'm happy to say that this process seems to have a lot of integrity. There's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of critical scrutiny. Anything we thought they may not pay attention to, they have. And it makes me feel good from an integrity standpoint. But that also means that the process is taking longer. We do have a lot of different properties into one project, and I know that's complicating. For this process, it'd be easier if it was one big block of land, I imagine. Yeah. Having the right contracted partners made all the difference in the world. There's a lot of communication, a lot of coordination that goes into this, and we want to build a lot of trust. And so we've been really happy working with Anu, Blue Source, originally now Anu. And we continue to feel that this is a good approach for conservation. I understand everybody's kind of, and Nisqually is a land trust that we've followed in their journey through their carbon market, and they have a different use. We feel really good about us redirecting towards more land protection. I certainly understand what it takes to own and manage forests and forest lands in this region. And I think, how you choose to use that revenue. I get it. It's hard you need resources to manage land, but I feel great that we're going to go buy more forests. And I also think that, our kind of credits, if you're working for a conservation organization selling carbon credits on land that's permanently conserved and that brings all these other values, I think that's very attractive in the marketplace. It's also regional. You can drive by the forest. You can even go hike or hunt or fish on these lands and know that if you are buying credits from this project, that you're helping conserve this area. So that's very brief. I think I'll wait for more questions. Thanks.
Well, hello, everyone. I know we're getting late in the day. I want to take a moment to thank Catherine and to thank the Estuary Partnership for putting this together. This has been great. It's been awesome to learn from all the other folks doing work in this space. So I'm Alan Warren with Bonneville Environmental Foundation. I'll talk with you a little bit about a project that we're doing to scale up what we call our regional carbon credits, or our carbon credits regional operator program. Briefly about Bonneville, we do a variety of things. So Bonneville has a pretty large footprint, small but mighty organization where we do everything from water quantity issues in the Colorado River Basin to big renewable energy deployment projects all across the country and internationally. And then I'm part of the watersheds program. My work is pretty much entirely focused right now in Washington. And I wanted to try to draw a line between some of what we've heard today. My primary focus within Washington is we're the nonprofit backbone organization to the Floodplains by Design program, which is a state integrated floodplain management grant program. So the kind of multi-benefit approach between flood risk reduction, salmon habitat restoration, and ag viability. And our work as the NGO backbone is largely focused on helping local implementation organizations leverage funds to get more funding deployed for that type of work and to help add capacity. One of the ways we do that, to tie it back to some of what we heard earlier today, is helping like staff at the Estuary Partnership with legislative outreach. So Floodplains by Design has traditionally been a $50 million every biennium program. This last cycle, we were able to expand that to $67 million. That 17 million that we were able to grow by was funding from the Climate Commitment Act, which you heard Mike Johnson present on earlier. And out of that huge pot of funding, the Natural Climate Solutions account was the pot that we were able to draw from, which ultimately, because we were able to expand it, the Estuary Partnership got their Lower East Fork River Floodplain Reconnection Project funded. So just, these are all tied together, all the things that we're talking about today. And even hearing Joe Kane's name, that goes back to where this work, my journey on this work started. He was a close partner of ours with the Nisqually Land Trust when I was at Pierce Conservation District, which I'll touch on a little bit here as well. The goal here, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the scope, but the goal of this project, and this is funded by a different national estuary program, the Puget Sound Geographic Program of the National Estuary EPA funding. We've got a 4-year grant to scale up this carbon credits kind of operator model. But it's really looking at a funding gap within the overall restoration system. There's a lot of different funding sources for restoration or for preservation. I think the state invests somewhere between $200 and $400 million every biennial cycle for these types of projects. But within all that money, there is no funding for long-term stewardship. All these organizations go out and do all this great work to get plants put in the ground, rivers restored, forests conserved, but there's no funding to maintain that over time. And that's the gap that this project is trying to address by leveraging carbon credits that then can go back to those implementation organizations to fund and support the long-term stewardship of those sites. We're doing this with 6 partners. I mentioned it's a Puget Sound focused pot of funding. BEF, I was able to convince our leadership to invest a little bit of money so that we could bring on the Estuary Partnership and Chris and his team as kind of an outside the Puget Sound kind of partner to see how this works. And so these are the partners, the implementation partners that we have. It's intentional that they're different types of organizations, from counties to salmon enhancement groups to conservation districts, different scales of projects. We not only want to see this be successful in the sense of getting those dollars back into the hands of restoration partners for stewardship, but we want to find out where it works, where it doesn't work, with what entities does it work. And so we intentionally brought on a number of different partners at different scales. And then we have a few other partners that are helping look at some of the policy components of it. And if everything works, we'll have, the partners will have restored 500 acres of, or preserved, I should say. There's 2 protocols we're working under. 500 acres of restoration or preservation, and leveraging that down eventually with about $3 million in carbon credit revenue that could then support that long-term stewardship. I should say, let me go back one. We've got two projects moved forward already this year: the Skagit Conservation District and the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group. They're both planted their projects this winter. And so right now they're going through that process of entering their projects into the carbon credit protocols, eventually getting that verified, certified, the credits, and then we'll be in a position to start working on trying to sell those credits. So Jessica touched on the lengthy process of verifying that. That's where we're kind of entering into with those 2 initial partners. And then for the next 3 years, 1 or 2 projects will get planted each winter. Most of these are planting projects, restoration projects, but Whatcom County is particularly interested in the preservation protocol. So they're looking at using it to preserve what would be at risk to development existing forest stands. Going back to where this started, before I joined BEF, I was with Pierce Conservation District, and we had Salmon Recovery Funding Board dollars, which is one of the grant programs in Washington that funds restoration. It was part of a large 100-acre restoration site, and we got approached by City Forest Credits, who's the carbon registry that we're partnering in this whole effort with. City Forest Credits is a niche, relatively new carbon registry. And they're what we call a carbon plus model. So they, in addition to quantifying the carbon, they also quantify the water quality benefits and they quantify the air quality benefits, other things like energy reduction for having a more dense tree canopy close to urban centers. And so that's the city aspect of it. These projects have a geographic limitation where they have to be close to a metropolitan area, and that the carbon plus component is essentially quantifying the health benefits to that urban population. And so the East Fort Lewis project, as an example, is right up the road in Longview or near Longview. That fits within that geographic boundary. It does not work everywhere. Oregon has significant limitations because they have a different approach to metropolitan planning than Washington does. So it kind of narrows the geography. But we were approached by City Forest Credits when I was at Pierce to see if we wanted to try to pilot something. And we ended up getting a Boeing grant to give us the capacity to go do that. I was actually the person on our team that was most reluctant and skeptical because I was under the assumption that the long-term monitoring requirements of it and the just the capacity was going to take to do the carbon credit monitoring and all the paperwork was going to exceed the revenues that we brought in. And then so the Boeing grant helped us just have the staff time and the capacity to go figure it out. And fast forward, and when they send out these slides, I'm not going to click on these links right now, but these are a couple of links that you can kind of learn a little bit more about it. But part of the process was working with Recreation and Conservation Office, the agency that granted us the funds, to say, is this okay? And they gave us approval. And then since that project was completed, they actually changed some of their funding policy to explicitly say it's okay. And the policy consideration here is that those are state capital bond funds. So the bond is a tax exempt, federally tax exempt bond. And so when you leverage those capital dollars and create new revenues off of them, there could be implications for the tax exempt status of the bond, which is a very big deal. It's a $4 billion bond. So that's their policy approach to address that, was to basically require that if you do this, if you leverage state investments in this way, the revenues have to be used for the long-term stewardship of the site. To date, they're the only agency to explicitly address that policy. So that, again, going back to our partner slide, there's also a variety of different funding sources. And so as we implement these projects, I'll be working with those agencies to get similar policy put in place with their grant guidelines. And so it does tie back to the policy component. That's an interesting part of it, I think. And so the other co-benefits are like, this ties in with, in Washington, the HEAL Act, which is it's targeting, state investments to have more of an impact on those historically the communities that have historically been more impacted by pollution or more impacted by environmental degradation, and the Commitment Act reporting. So one thing about this is, as dollars from the Climate Commitment Act are getting deployed, the state also wants to know, like, how much carbon sequestration are those investments leading to? And there's not really a tool to quantify that. And so in a sliver of some of that investment, we can use these metrics that emerge from verifying and quantifying these carbon plus models to say, hey, at least for these investments, here is the number back to you. And then we're looking at a couple of different ways of expanding this as well. At the end of the month, we're going to be submitting a grant to the U.S. Forest Service. They have a small forest landowners program that is really aimed at giving those types of landowners 2,500 acres and below. So again, a different scale than what Jessica and Ian were just describing. Wanting those types of small forest landowners to have better access to these markets. It's traditionally industrial lands, the best management practices that have access to the markets where those smaller forest land, those smaller property owners really don't. And so one nice thing for us with the Forest Service grant, if it's awarded, is it doesn't have the Puget Sound geographic limitation that our existing funding has. So we're expanding it with partners here in Oregon, or actually, sorry, we're in Washington. In Oregon, in Eastern Washington, Central Washington, trying to deploy it up more broadly and expand the geographic scope of it, while also working with a new landowner type. Like right now, most of our projects are the riverine restoration, riparian type plantings. And so within that scope, we'll also be developing some more, Jessica kind of touched on this, like there's a need for further educating the buyer side of the equation, and getting folks on that side, the corporate partners, to understand the validity of these credits, the value of them, how they're creating more resiliency, how they're creating more health benefits to communities, and continue to kind of help educate that side of the equation. And then what we already have in place, which we're helping right now, we're playing a very similar role under this climate resilient riparian systems lead, the kind of an NGO backbone role to this new $30 million 5-year investment from EPA. That Department of Ecology is the lead on. We're a partner, and the State Conservation Commission is a partner. It's baked into that partnership that we'll start scaling this program up with new partners that are deploying riparian funding. Again, that's limited to the Puget Sound region, so we're just continuing to look at other ways to kind of expand it beyond just those funds, and bring in additional partners, and see how this can work, and add capacity to the whole system. And I think that's about it. And we can move to questions after Chris's.
All right, last talk. That's all I'm going to start now. Oh, thanks. Not only was I late, but I'm gonna throw the pointer at the ground too. So I'm Chris Collins with the Estuary Partnership. Work with Catherine and Elaine. For those that don't know us, we host Science to Policy Summit every year. It's pretty cool. You should check it out. Speakers are top notch. So I wanted to talk today. I manage the Steigerwald project, work with a few people in the room on that effort. And we kind of saturated the airways a little bit with this project. We talked about it a lot. So really today, I'm not going to rehash the details of the project. We're just going to use it as a framework to talk about project emissions, how we tried to reduce them on this project, and then also sequester them, and then what we can do better in the future with emissions reduction and sequestration. Surprised you gave this back to me. So quick overview of the presentation. We'll do a very quick summary of the project. We'll talk about the emissions footprint of the project, how we sequestered those emissions, and then in the future, what we want to do for mitigation, meaning to reduce our emissions and then also sequester them on future projects. So project overview, really quick. The basic benefit of the project is we reconnected about 1.5 square miles of Columbia River floodplain. It's right down the road here in Washougal, the Steigerwald Refuge. To do that, we realigned a federally regulated levee system. So that involved a lot of earthwork. We had to build 1.6 miles of new setback levee. We removed 2.25 miles of existing levee, raised about 1/4 mile of State Route 14, placed over 2,200 pieces of wood. That's all the bad stuff. But on the good side, as far as emissions are concerned, we replanted about 250 acres of riparian forest. Climate change considerations. When we were designing the project, we did focus on making it climate resilient. So I think we did a good job of adaptation. And we made a big effort on sequestration. In a perfect world, with the benefit of hindsight, we would have done more on the mitigation front. And again, we'll talk about some of those lessons learned today. So, very carbon intensive infrastructure project. We built, again, 1.6 miles of levee. That was 1.7 million cubic yards of earthwork, which required about 430,000 gallons of diesel fuel. We also needed 1,100 cubic yards of concrete. Some of that, or most of that, went into the flood wall, which is a part of the levee system. And then we needed almost 250,000 pounds of steel, a lot of rebar, and also 3 bridges. So tally it all up, and it was about almost 14.5 million pounds of CO2 that was emitted during construction of the project. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we did, again, replant a lot of habitat, 250 acres, 750,000 plants have gone in the ground. We're in the process of, establishing those plantings. And if Ian's numbers made Jessica's nervous, mine definitely will. But I'll just go ahead and say that based on our estimates, and we looked at a couple different methodologies, it'll take 8 to 12 years for those plantings to sequester all of our project emissions. So we were pretty excited about that. Again, I will say this was an informal accounting. We did this to help us understand where our emissions are coming from, what we can do to manage them and sequester them in the future. This was not about, verifying credits. No money is changing hand. It's just us understanding what our impact is. So with that in mind, things we did not include, the earthwork, carbon released as a result of soil disturbance. We did not include that. We're just starting to look at the wood impacts and to understand those, but those were not included in that CO2 emissions estimate. The other thing that was not included is volunteer recruitment, particularly of cottonwoods. So before the project, the refuge was primarily reed canary grass and managed hayfields. They were hayed or grazed. And now with the restored habitat, we're getting a lot of volunteer recruitment. So there's some, probably significant amount of sequestration associated with that. So that's Steigerwald. And then moving forward, what did we learn and how are we going to apply this to future projects? So really quick, 5 different points I want to make. The first one is to start early. I think the biggest magnitude of impact as far as your emissions portfolio or your emissions footprint for a project happens in the alternatives analysis phase. So in the red circle here is 3 different alignments that we looked at for the Steigerwald levee. Not very impressive on paper, but I assure you there was a giant difference between these, not only in the length of levee that we would have had to construct, but also the elevation of the ground and therefore the height of the levee. So based on estimates, alternative A is what we ended up building. So that's the straight one here. And that was a total full project of 1.7 million cubic yards. Had we gone with B or C, we would have increased that earthwork amount between 5 and roughly 15%. Those are estimates. We didn't design these alternatives. We were just looking at some basic calculations. So that would have increased our emissions by at least 500,000 pounds, probably somewhere around the order of 1.5 million. So big movement in the right direction with an alternatives analysis. I'd like to say that we were this incredibly insightful, clairvoyant group, but really we were just trying to keep the project alive. We were trying to drive down cost when we were having these discussions, but in the reality is we really reduced our footprint at the same time. The second thing I want to say is I think it's really important, obviously, to know your audience. You're going to talk to a lot of different stakeholders with these projects. Most of you know that already. Some of them care about cost, but some don't. a lot of them see these projects being funded, which they are, by large federal agencies, so the BPAs and the federal highways, and saving those agencies a couple $100,000, maybe $1 million or $2 million, is not really going to resonate with them. But if we talk about emissions reduction, it might, and it probably will. Those two things are typically correlated with each other, positively correlated. So as you're driving down emissions, you're driving down cost and vice versa. But I think we can gain a lot more traction with some stakeholders if we focus on emissions as our currency. Rebuild infrastructure to meet current levels of risk. Catherine and I talked about this yesterday, and this might be pretty unique to Steigerwald, the Columbia River, the Willamette River. Typically, when we talk about meeting current and future levels of risk, we're talking about increasing the capacity of infrastructure. So bigger culverts, higher levees. Climate is getting more unpredictable, more dramatic, bigger storm events. So our infrastructure needs to be able to respond to that or handle that, have the capacity to deal with it. But there are situations like here where we had a levee system that was built prior to flow regulation in the Columbia River. Our base flood elevation is dropped at the site 7 feet. Yet we, because of regulations, and I say this and I'll caveat it, the intent is not to bash the Corps. There are regulations and congressional authorizations they have to deal with. But the reality is if we as an industry can work together to build infrastructure to meet current and future levels of risk, there are situations where that means reducing the capacity of the infrastructure. And here, if we had been able to do that, it would have saved us or reduced our emissions by somewhere in the order of about 10 or 20%. So that's a big number. Less wood. Wood definitely has an impact. We can talk details maybe later during the speed dating part of the day. But I'd like to see us move from using wood really for critical, critical habitat functions where you're protecting infrastructure. It definitely has a role, but where we can, let's move away from wood and more towards BDAs, microtopography, vegetation, things that can provide similar habitat functions in some circumstances. And then we will need to use wood. There's no getting away from it. We like it. It's fun to design, it's fun to build, and it really does have a critical function. But when we need it, let's import less. And what we do import, let's get it from sustainably harvested sources. The worst thing that we can do, which we have done in the past for sure, it's what we did at Steigerwald, is source it through a construction contractor because they go out and buy timber sales. And we don't want our wood to come from clear cuts. We want it to come from either sustainably managed sources or even better, salvage sources where there's been blowdown or there's other sources of wood that are coming out anyway. It's going to get chipped. It's going to end up in somebody's wood stove. Let's use that for our projects when possible. All right, so concluding thoughts. Emissions are unavoidable, particularly for these large projects. We need to restore habitat and we need to build the recreation infrastructure to get people out to enjoy them, to connect with them. I think that's important. So when you're thinking about emissions, start early in the process. Again, alternatives analysis is really important. Building stakeholder support for emissions reduction as an objective of your design and project development process is super important. Emissions reduction does have the added benefit of reducing cost. It also typically means less work, which means less schedule risk and other things that keep project managers up at night. And don't forget, sequestration is a powerful tool. I suggest being aggressive with your plantings, particularly with the tree species like cottonwood in your plant portfolio, and also be aggressive with their survival. Our summers are getting longer and warmer and drier. So it's important to consider things that we haven't considered in the past to make sure those forests do reestablish. And that includes things like watering plants where possible. That's all I had. Thank you.
Okay, so that was amazing. to fit that much learning for me into that short amount of time. So we have another opportunity until about 2:25 for question and answer. So the same rules as this morning. If you don't want to ask your question personally, there's note cards in the middle of the table. Just hold them up and we'll run around and grab them. I have the mic. So if you're in the audience and want to ask a question, I will bring the mic to you. And Doug has questions online. Doug does not have questions online. Oh, Aaron doesn't have questions. Nobody has questions online. Who has a question in here? Back here. And while she's asking the question, I'm going to run around and grab note cards because I'm sure you guys have bunches of them, right?
Thanks. So I guess my question is kind of towards Jessica, Ian, and Alan, like the three of you with your the credits. And I just have this wondering because I know that in our region, a lot of schools own forested land. For example, like Wakayakum has 100 acres of forested land that they're really not doing much with. Glenwood, I know, does, Skamania. So several places do. And what is, or is there potentially an opportunity for schools to engage in this and then generate revenue for their schools, and or are they? And what are your thoughts on that?
Use the mic.
Right. So that example, I think probably would potentially work with the city forest credit protocol in that it sounds like they're not currently harvesting or doing any kind of, there's no, as far as what I understand about the model you all are talking about is like it's the delta between, if they're currently harvesting and changing those practices to get more carbon sequestered versus that sort of property could be preserved if it doesn't have a conservation easement on it already, where if development is coming around it, the city forest credits protocol might be something that you could deploy there to put a conservation easement, prevent it from ever being developed. And it's that preservation of it that creates the carbon credit. So there's opportunities there. It's just, you get into the details of where's the development in relation to where that parcel is. And the carbon credit protocol requires that development is encroaching, like there is viable development on and around that site. So you have to show that it's actually at risk and verify that it would be at risk without this preservation opportunity.
So the example of 100 acres is pretty small, obviously, but there are opportunities. Like we've worked with different municipalities that have pooled their forests together to create a program. And obviously, like he said, you have to demonstrate the risk to it. But another opportunity is actually the American Family Forest Foundation. They have a program for small landowners that don't usually fit the model of the larger registries. And so that's what we always refer a lot of smaller landowners to, is it's a really great program. And they're able to kind of pool all of those smaller forests to create a larger, pool of credits that are accessible and can generate revenue for these smaller entities. So.
Well, I'm just going to add, the challenge is that the value of carbon credits isn't high enough. Hopefully that market changes. So right now the carbon credit prices only work if you have other values that you're also working with. Otherwise, like in Wakayakum or rural communities, they're going to look to cut all the trees because there's way more valuable in sending it to the mill than keeping it standing.
And the one distinction I would make with working in kind of that urban interface, less than the true rural spaces, is 100 acres is a big project site. When you're trying to keep, like the ecosystem benefits for communities, 100 acres is significant, whether it's on the restoration side or whether it's on the preservation side. And so there's the value proposition, and that's where like a niche carbon credit like city forest credits has a way of making that value proposition work a little bit better, where for the forest practice carbon registries, you have to have thousands of acres for it to pencil out. And so there's definitely some just distinctions between the different protocols.
I think we have a question online, Erin.
Yes, Anne asks, is there an effort to more accurately determine long-term carbon sequestration at Steigerwald?
Not right now. Whoa, geez. Not right now, no. Like I said, what we've done, there's no, at this point, there's no effort to, or we haven't considered like selling credits or quantifying them in a more formal way. It's all been to sort of, again, help us understand where our emissions are and where we can reduce them on future projects, kind of the magnitude of each contributing source of emissions. So I don't think we're going to spend additional effort to quantify them. I think what we'll do is continue, um, sort of preaching the good word and thinking about how we as an industry, as a community can further reduce our emissions on future projects.
Having said that, I think there is some interest in potentially putting some of the EduFlux towers out there. So at some point, it would allow us to, at least going forward, we don't have the baseline that we could use to compare it to, but we would at least be able to look at the carbon methane flux at some point, maybe. Assuming we could find a safe place to put those expensive equipment.
Yeah, and we are monitoring our planting. So in the future, we could look at those numbers to kind of back check what our original estimates were as far as sequestration.
Excellent. One more question. Does anybody have one in the room? Oh, right here.
Super quick, this is for Ian. You were talking about how folks out there will pay for the other benefits. Are there, who's paying? What are those markets?
That's on. I think what I was referring to, correct me if I'm missing the question correctly, but that you can go out and buy carbon credits and it's just a carbon credit out in the world. But the added benefits of buying credits close to home with nature close to home and the water, the other added benefits, I think is appealing to some buyers of credits, people looking to offset their impacts locally or regionally.
The Nature Conservancy in Washington is also looking at biodiversity offset markets and the potential for that to add value to some of the climate offset work as well. So kind of layering different offsets. So there's the market side of it, and then we're seeing some increased interest from kind of larger corporations in I think it's, I always get the acronym wrong, ESG, but like impact investments. So basically saying, we have these sustainability statements, we have these we're accountable to our stockholders and our sustainability statements, and they have to go out and invest in things to prove that sustainability. And so some of that is going into things like biodiversity credits.
Yeah. So I was just going to add to what Rose was talking about with the other benefits, those being the co-benefits of every project. So every project that we develop has a set of co-benefits that go with it, and they're going to vary based upon the property and what's happening on the ground. And so obviously the 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals that's put out by the UN, are something that we use to help identify and fit projects with our buyers. And so that's, in addition to like location and the story behind the actual impacts of the project, SDGs are a huge additional co-benefit that a lot of buyers take into consideration when they're evaluating carbon projects and what fits in with their own sustainability targets and initiatives that they're trying to meet. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but those are the other benefits that, I would refer to.
I appreciate all of that. And the underlying question is there a dollar associated?
Oh, I would say, yeah, there is.
People are paying more, like there's
At times.
a scale.
It's obviously a cyclical market, but co-benefits do have the ability to garner a higher price point in the market, as well as location. Like in this area, for instance, there's not a lot of improved forest management projects in the Northwest, and they tend to sell out quite quickly and at a slightly higher price point. We're not talking, super significant, but it's still higher. So, yeah.
Okay, I think that wraps up this question and answer. Gratitude to our panel. Those were fantastic presentations.
And for folks that are here in the room, for folks that are that are participating remotely, we are going to probably stop, I think, at this point, because there's no way for you to really participate in the speed dating part of the program. So what we're going to do is we're going to have these 5 panelists kind of go to different tables, and for 15 minutes or so, you can go and talk to them and one-on-one and ask your questions one-on-one with them. So I'm going to assign tables, and folks are going to have to get up and move around a little bit. So Ian Sinks has got to skedaddle a little bit early, so I'm going to put him in the back table here so that he has to leave by around 3. So if you're really interested in talking to Ian, do that soon. And then the next table, I'm going to try to put Jessica. Is that okay? That table right there. Thanks. This table right here, I think I'm going to try to put Rose. Is that okay? Alrighty. And then with Tom Josephson, Tom, could you please raise your hand? I think Alan Warren, do you mind being over there by Tom Josephson? And the folks from Tillamook, I believe, over there. I think, is there anybody I haven't, is it left? Chris, do you mind going and hanging out with folks from Tillamook over there?